I never understood why my husband grew increasingly secretive about his business trips, until the day he announced at our anniversary dinner that he was leaving me for his assistant. What he didn't know was that I was the anonymous angel investor who had saved his struggling company 5 years ago, and I still owned controlling interest through a shell corporation. His betrayal had just become the most expensive mistake of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal champagne flute trembled in my hand as Richard, my husband of 20 years, cleared his throat at the head of our dining table. Our anniversary dinner, which I had spent all day preparing, sat untouched before us, the candles flickering across his unnaturally composed face. My stomach tightened with instinctive dread as I registered the careful distance in his eyes, a look I'd seen more frequently in recent months but had desperately tried to ignore. "Elaine," he began, his voice carrying a rehearsed quality that made my skin prickle. "We need to talk about our future." I set my glass down with deliberate care, the vintage champagne, imported from a small French vineyard we had visited on our 10th anniversary, suddenly tasting like bitter metal on my tongue. 20 years of marriage had given me an intimate knowledge of Richard's expressions, and the one he wore now wasn't simply discontent, it was resolution. "That sounds ominous," I replied, attempting levity though my heart had already begun its painful descent. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he continued, his eyes fixed on a point just beyond my shoulder, refusing to meet my gaze. "About life, about happiness, about what I really want." Outside, a soft summer rain began to patter against the windows of our colonial-style home in Connecticut, the home we had restored together room by room over 2 decades, the home where we had planned to grow old together. "And what is it that you want, Richard?" My voice remained steady, betraying none of the earthquake beginning within me. He inhaled deeply, finally meeting my eyes with a look that held not remorse, but impatience, as if this conversation were an inconvenient business meeting he needed to conclude before moving on to more important matters. "I want a different life, Elaine. I'm sorry, but our marriage isn't working for me anymore. It hasn't been for some time." The practiced way he delivered these words told me everything I needed to know. He had been rehearsing this speech, probably for weeks. The signs had been there, the late nights at the office, the business trips that grew increasingly vague in purpose, the distracted responses to my questions, the password changes on his phone. "I see," I said, because there was nothing else to say. The carefully prepared anniversary dinner congealed between us, an elaborate metaphor for our disintegrating marriage. "Is there someone else?" The slight flinch around his eyes answered before his words did. "That's not the point." "It is absolutely the point, Richard," I interrupted, my voice still measured despite the rising tide of anger. "After 20 years, I deserve the truth. Is there someone else?" The momentary flash of annoyance across his face, that I wasn't making this easier for him, sparked a cold fury deep within me. "Yes," he finally admitted, straightening his shoulders as if preparing for battle. "Vanessa." The name hit me like a physical blow. Vanessa Winters, his executive assistant of 3 years, the woman who called our home on weekends with urgent business matters. The woman whose name appeared with increasing frequency in his stories about the office. The woman who, at 31, was exactly 20 years my junior. "Your assistant." It wasn't a question. "She understands me, Elaine. She supports my vision for the company in ways you never have. We connect on multiple levels." I raised my hand, silencing him mid-justification. "Spare me the cliches. Please, how long?" He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the fine wool of his tailored suit, a birthday gift from me just 2 months earlier, creasing slightly. "That's not important. How long Richard. 8 months, he admitted finally. But it started as just friendship. We never meant for it to happen. 8 months. While I had been planning our anniversary trip to Bali, while I had been volunteering at the hospital, while I had been managing our investment portfolio and attending his company functions, he had been betraying every vow we had ever made. I've already found an apartment in the city, he continued, his words now tumbling out in a rush. I'll be moving out this weekend. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. Your lawyer, I repeated, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. You've already spoken to a lawyer. I think it's best if we handle this efficiently, Richard said, his voice slipping into the same tone he used for difficult business negotiations. You'll be taken care of course. The prenup is generous. A sharp laugh escaped me, so harsh that it momentarily startled him into silence. The prenuptial agreement, the document that would now entitle me to a percentage of his personal wealth and our shared assets, but not any part of his precious company, Growth Curve Technologies, the company that had consumed his every waking thought for 15 years, the company that, as far as Richard knew, I had merely supported from the sidelines as the dutiful corporate wife. What Richard didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask, was that 5 years ago, when Growth Curve Technologies was on the brink of bankruptcy, I had become his company's salvation. The mysterious angel investor who had poured $12 million into Growth Curve through a shell corporation called Phoenix Ventures had not been the anonymous Silicon Valley veteran he'd assumed. It had been me, investing my inheritance, from my grandmother, channeled through a complex structure of LLCs and offshore accounts established by my brother, a financial advisor whose discretion I had secured with the promise of making him chief financial advisor when I eventually revealed my ownership. Yes, the prenup, I said, my mind racing ahead to calculations and contingencies that Richard couldn't begin to imagine. Tell me, Richard, how is the latest round of funding going for Growth Curve's expansion into the European market? Confusion flickered across his face at this apparent non sequitur. It's proceeding well. We have interested parties. Why are you asking about that now? Just curious about the future of your company, I replied, reaching for my champagne and taking a deliberate sip. Since we're discussing business matters. Richard's brow furrowed slightly, but his relief at my seemingly calm acceptance of his betrayal overrode any suspicion. He had expected tears, recriminations, perhaps even begging. My composed response clearly unsettled him, though not enough to make him reconsider his course. I am sorry, Elaine, he said, having the decency to at least look uncomfortable. I never wanted to hurt you. And yet, here we are, I replied, my gaze steady as I carefully placed my napkin on the table and stood. You should go now, Richard. I think we've said all that needs to be said tonight. He hesitated, perhaps surprised by my composure, before nodding and rising from his chair. I'll come by on Saturday to get my things while you're at your book club. How considerate of him to remember my schedule, I thought bitterly, even as he was tearing our life apart. I simply nodded, not trusting myself to speak further. At the doorway he paused, looking back at me standing beside our anniversary dinner, the candles still flickering between us. For a moment, something like doubt crossed his features. You'll be all right, won't you? The question ignited a cold flame within me. He wasn't asking out of concern for my emotional well-being. He was seeking absolution, wanting reassurance, that his departure wouldn't completely destroy me so he could leave with a clean conscience. Oh, Richard, I said softly, a smile curving my lips that didn't reach my eyes. I'm going to be much better than all right. He nodded, misinterpreting my response as brave acceptance rather than the veiled promise it was. The front door closed, behind him with a decisive click, and I stood motionless in our dining room, listening to the engine of his BMW start and then fade as he drove away from our home of 20 years, toward Vanessa, toward his new life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, toward what he thought would be his happy ending. Only when the house had fallen completely silent did I allow myself to sink back into my chair, my composed mask slipping away. But the tears that threatened didn't fall. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed a number I rarely used. "William," I said when my brother answered. "It's time to activate phase 2 of our contingency plan. Richard has made his move." My brother's sharp intake of breath was followed by a moment of silence. "Are you certain, Elaine? Once we do this—" "He's leaving me for his assistant," I cut in, my voice now hard with resolve. "He's already seen a lawyer and is moving out this weekend, so yes, I'm certain." "I'll make the calls first thing tomorrow," William replied, his tone shifting to match my determination. "The board won't know what hit them." As I hung up, I walked to the study and unlocked the hidden safe behind the landscape painting Richard had never particularly liked, a fitting metaphor for how little attention he had paid to my true capabilities. Inside lay folders containing documentation of my ownership structure in growth curve technologies, evidence of my identity as the controlling investor who had saved Richard's company when all other potential backers had abandoned him. Richard had always underestimated me, viewing my interest in his business as simple wifely support rather than the calculated investment strategy of a woman who had majored in finance before setting aside her career to support his. He had never questioned where Phoenix Ventures had come from, so grateful for the last-minute infusion of capital that had saved him from humiliating bankruptcy. He had been content to deal with my brother as the front man, never once suspecting that the true power behind his company's salvation sat across from him at the breakfast table every morning. I closed the safe and returned to the dining room, blowing out the anniversary candles one by one. The darkness felt appropriate as I contemplated the storm that was about to engulf Richard's carefully planned new life. "You have no idea what's coming," I whispered to the empty room, the first genuine smile of the evening finally reaching my eyes. Richard had just made the most expensive mistake of his life, and I was going to enjoy every moment of his realization that in abandoning his wife, he had also alienated his company's most important investor. As I climbed the stairs to what had been our bedroom, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The shock and pain would come later, I knew. But for now, I allowed myself to savor the initial phase of what would become my masterful revenge. Richard thought he was walking away from an aging wife toward a bright new future. He had no idea. He was actually walking straight into a carefully orchestrated trap of my own design. Richard and I met at Northwestern University during my senior year. I was completing my finance degree with honors, already fielding offers from several prestigious firms in Chicago, while he was struggling through his MBA program with more ambition than actual business acumen. What Richard lacked in natural talent, however, he made up for with charisma and unwavering confidence. That confidence was what first attracted me to him. His absolute certainty that he would someday build a tech empire despite having limited coding skills and even less understanding of venture capital structures. People invest in people, not just ideas, he used to say, flashing that magnetic smile that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. And people want to invest in me. At 22, I found his conviction intoxicating. We married shortly after graduation, my practical nature complementing his dreamer mentality in ways that seemed perfect. I took a position at Merrill Lynch, while he cycled through startups, always chasing the next big idea, always certain that his breakthrough was just around the corner. 10 years into our marriage, when my grandmother passed away and left me a substantial inheritance, $12 million that my fiscally conservative family had kept quiet, Richard was working at a mid-level tech firm, his entrepreneurial dreams temporarily shelved. I was climbing the corporate ladder successfully, my investment portfolio outperforming market averages consistently enough that colleagues often sought my advice. "You should launch your own fund," my mentor suggested. over lunch one day. You have the talent and the track record. I considered it briefly, but Richard's newest aspiration intervened. He wanted to leave his job and start Growth Curve Technologies, a company focused on predictive analytics for retail businesses. His pitch was compelling. He had assembled a talented team of developers, secured a promising patent, and already had interest from several small businesses willing to beta test the software. "This is it, Elaine," he said, eyes bright with familiar excitement as he spread the business plan across our kitchen island. "This is the one that's going to change everything." What he lacked was capital. And against my better judgment, against the explicit advice of my financial advisors, I decided to support him, not just as a wife, but as an investor. But I did it my way. "I'm thinking of making some significant changes to my investment portfolio," I told my brother William over dinner. "Something with higher risk, but potentially much higher reward." William raised an eyebrow, his fork pausing, midway to his mouth. As my financial advisor and the only family member who knew the full extent of my inheritance, he had grown accustomed to my conservative investment approach. "That doesn't sound like you," he observed carefully. "What's changed?" "Nothing," I replied with practiced casualness. "I just think it's time to diversify." Later that night, after several glasses of wine and sworn promises of confidentiality, I revealed my true plan: to become the angel investor for Richard's new venture, anonymously. "He'll never take the money if he knows it's from me," I explained. His pride wouldn't allow it. William's skepticism was evident. "So, you want to create an elaborate shell company structure to secretly finance your husband's business venture without him ever knowing it's your money?" "Elaine, this crosses several ethical boundaries, not to mention potential legal complications." "Which is why I need your help to do it properly," I countered. "This way, he gets his chance without risking our entire financial security, and I maintain control of the investment through proper channels." After much deliberation, William reluctantly agreed, and Phoenix Ventures was born. A sophisticated structure of LLCs and offshore accounts that effectively masked my identity while giving me controlling interest. The name was my private joke, the mythical bird rising from the ashes, just as I would help Richard's dreams rise from the ashes of his previous failed attempts. When Phoenix Ventures approached Growth Curve Technologies with an offer of $12 million in exchange for 58% ownership, Richard was ecstatic. He assumed the investor was a tech veteran who recognized the potential of his patented algorithms. William, acting as my representative, negotiated terms that protected my investment while giving Richard operational control, as long as certain performance benchmarks were met. "Someone believes in me," Richard said that night, lifting me in a celebratory embrace as we stood in our kitchen. "Finally, someone with real money and influence sees what I've been saying all along." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me, but I smiled and poured more champagne. "I'm so proud of you," I said, meaning it despite the complicated truth. In that moment, seeing his face alight with validation and purpose, I convinced myself that the deception was worth it. This was my gift to him, a chance to prove himself without knowing I was his safety net. As Growth Curve Technologies grew, from a scrappy startup to a respected player in the analytics field, I maintained my double life. By day, I was the supportive corporate wife who had scaled back her own career to focus on our life together, attending company functions on Richard's arm, hosting dinner parties for his investors and team members. By night, I was reviewing quarterly reports, analyzing market strategies, and conferring with William about critical decisions facing the company. In board meetings, William represented Phoenix Ventures' interests, delivering my carefully worded guidance as if it came from a reclusive tech billionaire who preferred to remain anonymous. Richard occasionally expressed frustration with Phoenix's, demanding standards and detailed questions, never suspecting that he was actually complaining about his wife's business acumen. "The mysterious Mr. Phoenix is obsessed with European expansion," he grumbled one evening as we prepared for bed. "He's pushing us to move faster than I'm comfortable with." I hid my smile as I applied my night cream. "Maybe he sees potential you don't," I suggested mildly. "After all, he did bet $12 million on your vision." Richard's expression softened as he came to stand behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders as he met my eyes in the mirror. "You're right. I just wish sometimes that he trusted me a little more to run things my way." The guilt I felt in those moments was complicated. On one hand, I was deceiving the man I loved. On the other, I was protecting our financial future, while giving him the opportunity to succeed on what appeared to be his own merit. I told myself it was a loving deception, a necessary compromise. 5 years into this arrangement, as Growth Curve Technologies continued its steady growth and Richard's confidence soared with each successful quarter, I began to notice subtle changes in our relationship. The man who had once shared every business challenge with me over dinner now deflected my questions about work. The husband who had sought my advice on everything from hiring decisions to marketing strategies now changed the subject when I inquired about company matters. The first time Richard canceled our anniversary trip due to a critical business meeting that couldn't be rescheduled, I accepted his apology with grace. When he missed my father's funeral because of an emergency investor call that William later confirmed never happened, I began to wonder. And when Vanessa's name started appearing in his anecdotes with increasing frequency, her contributions to company successes highlighted with particular enthusiasm, I recognized the signs I had been ignoring. "How's the new assistant working?" "Out?" I asked casually over breakfast one morning, noting how he brightened at the mere mention of her. "Vanessa? She's extraordinary," Richard replied, his expression animated in a way it rarely was when discussing our life together anymore. "She anticipates needs I didn't even know I had. Yesterday, she completely reorganized our approach to the Davis contract based on her previous experience in the industry. Saved us weeks of work." I nodded, filing away this information. "She sounds impressive." "She is," he agreed, checking his watch and standing to leave earlier than usual. "In fact, we're meeting early to prepare for the board presentation next week. Don't wait up tonight. It'll be a late one." As he kissed my cheek, a perfunctory gesture that had replaced our once passionate goodbyes, I caught the faint scent of an unfamiliar cologne. Watching him walk to his car with a lightness in his step that had been absent at home for months, I made a decision. That afternoon, I called William. "I need you to add an important condition to Phoenix's requirements for the next funding round," I said without preamble. "Any significant changes to upper management or the executive team must be approved by the majority shareholder." "Elaine," William's voice carried a note of warning. "What's going on?" "Insurance," I replied simply. "Just insurance." Looking back now, as I stood in our empty bedroom after Richard's announcement that he was leaving me for Vanessa, I recognized that I had known this day was coming long before I admitted it to myself. What I hadn't anticipated was how his betrayal would crystallize my purpose and strip away any remaining guilt about my deception. For 20 years, I had been two women. The supportive wife who had subsumed her ambitions to bolster her husband's dreams, and the shrewd investor who controlled the company he believed was his greatest achievement. Now those two women would merge into something new, someone Richard hadn't counted on facing when he so casually discarded 2 decades of marriage for his young assistant. The morning after Richard's devastating announcement, I awoke to an empty house that felt both hollow and liberating. The king-sized bed where we had shared thousands of nights now stretched before me like an unexplored continent. I allowed myself exactly 30 minutes to feel the loss, to acknowledge the death of the future I had planned, before rising to face the new reality I would create. My phone showed 6 missed calls from my sister, 4 from my closest friend Patricia, and 1 from William. No calls from Richard. I bypassed them all and dialed my lawyer, Diane Winters, a formidable divorce attorney whose reputation for surgical precision in high-net-worth cases had earned her the nickname the Scalpel among Connecticut's elite. "I need an appointment today," I said when she answered. "Richard is leaving me for his assistant." Her response was immediate and without sympathy, exactly what I needed. "I've had a cancellation at 11. Bring all financial documentation you can gather, especially anything related to his business interests." I smiled at this last instruction. Diane had no idea just how comprehensive my documentation would be. After a long shower, I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a charcoal Armani suit I reserved for important business meetings, which this certainly was. As I applied my makeup, I studied my reflection with new eyes. At 52, I was still attractive, my disciplined exercise regimen and careful skincare having preserved the bone structure that had once caught Richard's attention across a crowded university library. The fine lines around my eyes and mouth spoke of experience, not defeat. "Time to reclaim your power, Elaine," I told my reflection, applying a bold red lipstick I rarely wore. Richard had always preferred me in more subtle shades. At my home office, I retrieved the documents I would need from the hidden safe: incorporation papers for Phoenix Ventures, the original investment agreement, quarterly reports, and most crucially, the shareholder agreement giving Phoenix Ventures veto power over key management decisions. I placed these in my briefcase alongside the prenuptial agreement Richard had insisted upon before our wedding, a document that, ironically, protected only his personal assets and explicitly excluded future business interests not established at the time of our marriage. As I was leaving, William called again. This time, I answered. "I've been worried sick," he said without preamble. "Are you all right?" "I'm operational," I replied, using our childhood code for handling difficult situations. "Meeting with Diane Winters in an hour. I'll need you to call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow." His sharp intake of breath carried through the phone. "That fast? Elaine, are you sure you don't want to take some time to—" "The longer we wait, the more opportunity Richard has to maneuver," I cut in. "He's been planning this for months, William. We need to act now." "All right," he conceded. "But what exactly are you planning to do?" "I'm going to introduce Phoenix Ventures, owner to Growth Curve Technologies," I said simply. The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Finally, William sighed. "This is going to be nuclear, you know." "It's about to be," I confirmed, a cold smile forming as I started my car. "See you tomorrow at the board meeting. Wear your best suit." Diane's office occupied the top floor of a sleek glass building in downtown Hartford, the tasteful decor and hushed atmosphere designed to comfort the wealthy while they dismantled their marriages. Her assistant, a young man with impeccable manners, led me immediately to her corner office upon arrival. Diane rose from behind her imposing desk, her handshake firm and direct. At 60, with silver hair cut in a precise bob and eyes that missed nothing, she embodied the confident competence I needed. "Elaine," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk, "tell me everything, starting with when you first suspected." For the next hour, I laid out the trajectory of Richard's betrayal, the gradual withdrawal, the increasing mentions of Vanessa, the business trips that couldn't be verified, and finally, his announcement at our anniversary dinner. Diane took notes in a leather-bound notebook, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but otherwise allowing me to tell the story without interruption. When I finished, she set down her pen and studied me with professional assessment. "And what do you want from this divorce, Elaine? Maximum financial settlement? The house? Social vindication?" I smiled, reaching into my briefcase for the Phoenix Ventures documentation. "I want something more specific," I replied, sliding the folder across her desk. "I want control of Growth Curve Technologies, complete and acknowledged control." Diane's eyebrows rose slightly as she opened the folder and quickly scanned the contents. Her expression shifted from professional interest to genuine surprise. a rare reaction from someone who had seen every variety of marital deception. "You're Phoenix," she said, looking up at me with new respect. "You've been the controlling interest in your husband's company for 5 years without his knowledge." "Yes." "And now you want to use that position to—" "What? Exactly?" "To ensure that Richard understands precisely what his infidelity has cost him," I replied evenly. "The company is his identity, his achievement, his legacy. I want him to know that it was never truly his to begin with, and now, it never will be." Diane leaned back in her chair, considering me with newfound interest. "You realize this goes beyond the scope of typical divorce proceedings. The revelation of your identity as Phoenix Ventures will have significant business implications. The board, the shareholders, the company's clients, this will affect them all." "I'm aware, I said calmly. "I've spent 5 years protecting this company's interests as its majority shareholder. I won't destroy what I've helped build, but Richard needs to understand that actions have consequences." "And the girlfriend? The assistant? Vanessa?" Diane asked, making another note. "Let's just say her position within the company will be subject to review," I replied, the understatement deliberately mild compared to what I had planned. Diane closed the folder and tapped her fingers against it thoughtfully. "Well, this certainly changes our approach. Typically, I'd be fighting to get you a portion of the business value in the settlement. But you already own the majority of it." A small appreciative smile crossed her face. "That's rather brilliant, actually." "It wasn't planned as divorce insurance," I admitted. "It was meant to protect our joint financial future while giving Richard his chance to succeed." "And yet here we are," Diane observed. "Here we are," I agreed. She straightened in her chair. All business once more. "All right then. We'll still file for divorce, of course, but I suggest we delay serving him until after your revelation at the board meeting. The shock value alone will be significant leverage in negotiations." I nodded, retrieving a small flash drive from my purse and placing it on her desk. "This contains additional documentation you might find useful. Emails from Richard to Vanessa that William was able to access through the company server. Some are quite explicit about their relationship and their plans for after he leaves me." Diane picked up the drive with a raised eyebrow. "Obtained legally, I hope?" "William is the CIO of Growth Curve and the board representative for Phoenix Ventures. He has every right to monitor company communications, especially those that might impact shareholder value," I replied smoothly. "All emails were sent on company devices using company accounts." She pocketed the drive with a nod of approval. "You've been thorough. Now let's discuss tomorrow's board meeting. You're planning to reveal yourself as Phoenix Ventures to the entire board, including Richard?" "Yes," I confirmed. "William has called an emergency session under the pretext of discussing the European expansion funding. All board members will be present, including Richard and the CFO, Harriet Mills, who has been my unwitting ally in maintaining financial discipline at Growth Curve." "And how do you expect Richard to react?" Diane asked, her tone carefully neutral. I considered this question, trying to picture Richard's face when his world imploded. Initially, disbelief, then anger. He hates being blindsided. Then calculation. Richard always looks for angles, for ways to turn situations to his advantage. He'll try to find a way to wrest control back or to minimize the damage to his position. "Which won't be possible," Diane noted, reviewing the shareholder agreement again. "No," I agreed. "Phoenix Ventures, which is to say I, own 58% of Growth Curve Technologies. Richard owns 23%, with the remainder distributed among other minor investors and the employee stock option pool. The mathematics are quite straightforward." Diane closed her notebook and fixed me with an evaluative stare. "Elaine, I've represented hundreds of wronged spouses over my career. Most arrive in my office broken, furious, or both. You seem methodical, controlled. Are you certain you want to proceed this aggressively, this quickly? The question gave me pause. Was I being too calculating, too cold in my response to Richard's betrayal? The pain was there, certainly. 20 years of shared life discarded for a younger woman, the humiliation of being left on our anniversary, the casual cruelty of his planned departure during my book club. But beneath that pain lay something harder, something formed through years of watching Richard take credit for successes that my capital and my brother's guidance had made possible. Richard believes he's entitled to happiness at my expense, I said finally. He believes he can discard me and still keep the company that I saved, that my money built, that my judgment protected. I'm not being aggressive, Diane. I'm simply correcting his misconception. She held my gaze for a moment longer before nodding with what appeared to be approval. Very well. I'll prepare the divorce filing, but hold it until after tomorrow's meeting. Call me immediately afterward. I want a full report on his reaction. As I left her office, the weight of what I was about to do settled around my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of purpose. Tomorrow, Richard would discover that in choosing Vanessa over me, he had made a catastrophic business decision. The revelation would not just change the dynamics of our divorce, it would fundamentally alter his understanding of the past 5 years of his life. The thought should have brought satisfaction, perhaps even vindictive pleasure. Instead, I felt a strange calm, the quiet certainty of someone who had finally stopped playing a role and stepped into her authentic power. For 2 decades, I had been Richard's supportive wife. For 5 years, I had been his anonymous benefactor. Tomorrow, I would simply be myself, the woman who owned his company and was about to change his life forever. The day of the board meeting dawned with a crystalline clarity that seemed fitting for what was to come. I'd slept surprisingly well, waking before my alarm to the unfamiliar silence of the house. No sounds of Richard's shower running, no coffee machine humming on his programmed timer, no CNBC murmuring financial updates from the bedroom television. Just stillness and the gentle tick of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. AI, wedding gift from Richard's parents that had marked the passing of our 20 years together. Instead of feeling diminished by these absences, I found myself expanding into the empty spaces. I took my coffee onto the back terrace, something Richard had always complained about because he feared neighbors might see me in my robe, and watched the sun rise over our meticulously landscaped garden. Birds darted between the maple trees, unconcerned with human dramas. The world continued turning despite betrayal, despite endings, despite revelations yet to come. My phone vibrated with a text from William. Car service confirmed for 9:30. Documents printed and ready. Are you sure about this? I smiled at my brother's persistent concern. Absolutely, I texted back. See you there. The corporate headquarters of Growth Curve Technologies occupied 3 floors of a modern glass tower in Stamford, a 40-minute drive from my home in Greenwich. I had visited the offices a dozen times in my role as Richard's wife, always carefully performing the part of the impressed spouse being shown her husband's kingdom. Today would be different. I chose my outfit with strategic precision. A navy Chanel suit that conveyed authority without ostentation, paired with subtle diamond studs and my grandmother's sapphire ring, the one tangible reminder of the inheritance. That had changed everything. My makeup was flawless but minimal. My hair swept into a sleek chignon that emphasized my bone structure rather than attempting to disguise my age. I wasn't trying to compete with 31-year-old Vanessa on her terms. I would confront this situation on mine. As promised, the town car arrived at exactly 9:30. The driver, recognizing me from previous bookings, appeared momentarily confused. "Will Mr. Carter be joining us, ma'am?" he asked, holding the door. "No, Thomas. Just me today," I replied with a serene smile. The drive into Stamford gave me time to review my mental script for the meeting. William and I had discussed various scenarios, anticipating Richard's potential reactions and planning appropriate responses. But business strategy had never been the difficult part for me. The emotional landscape was far more treacherous. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the humiliation and the calculated cruelty of ending our marriage on our anniversary, a small part of me still loved the man I had built a life with. Not the Richard of today, the ambitious CEO who had discarded me for a younger model, but the Richard of our early years, the dreamer with the infectious grin who had believed so fiercely in his own potential. That love wouldn't stop me from taking what was rightfully mine, but it added a layer of complexity to what should have been straightforward retribution. "Ms. Elaine." Thomas's voice broke through my thoughts. "We've arrived." The growth curve. Technology's lobby featured a 15-foot interactive display showcasing the company's analytics platform in real time, a dramatic visualization of the very technology my investment had made possible. Employees moved purposefully across the polished concrete floors, many offering respectful nods as they recognized their CEO's wife. If only they knew. Security had been informed of my arrival, and a badge was waiting at the front desk. "Mrs. Carter, how lovely to see you," chirped the receptionist, a young woman whose name I couldn't recall. "The board meeting is on 32. Would you like me to have someone escort you?" "That won't be necessary, Kelsey," I replied, noting her surprise that I remembered her name, a small technique I had learned from Richard, ironically. "I know the way." The executive elevator required a special access card, which my visitor badge surprisingly accommodated. Another of William's careful preparations, ensuring I wouldn't be delayed or questioned. As the elevator ascended, I checked my reflection in its mirrored walls, adjusting my posture to project confidence. The woman staring back at me looked powerful, determined, and completely in control. The boardroom occupied the northeast corner of the 32nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Long Island Sound. 7 people were already seated around the massive blackwood table when I entered. 5 board members, including William, and 2 executives, Harriet Mills, the CFO, and Derek Johnson, the Chief Technology Officer. Richard sat at the head of the table, his back to the windows, the position of power he had always favored. The conversation stopped abruptly when I appeared in the doorway. Richard's expression shifted rapidly from surprise to confusion to barely concealed annoyance. "Elaine, what are you doing here?" I smiled pleasantly, noting how William straightened in his chair, his face carefully neutral. "Good morning, everyone. I apologize for any confusion, but today's meeting actually couldn't proceed without me." Richard stood, his movement sharp, with irritation. He wore the charcoal Tom Ford suit I had given him for Christmas, I noticed with a flash of irony. "Elaine, this is a private board meeting. I understand you might be upset about our conversation, but this is highly inappropriate." Before I could respond, the door behind me opened again, and Vanessa entered, carrying a portfolio and a tablet. She froze when she saw me, her professionally composed face flickering with unmistakable guilt before she recovered. "Mrs. Carter," she managed, the slight tremor in her voice betraying her discomfort. "I didn't realize you would be joining us today." "Evidently not," I replied evenly, holding her gaze until she looked away. Richard stepped around the table, lowering his voice as he approached me. "Elaine, please don't do this. Don't make a scene. We can talk later, in private." I met his eyes, noting the mixture of apprehension and condescension in them. He was worried about embarrassment, but confident in his control of the situation. That confidence was about to evaporate. "I'm not here to make a scene, Richard," I said, my voice carrying just enough to ensure everyone could hear. "I'm here as the majority shareholder of Growth Curve Technologies. This meeting concerns the European expansion funding, which requires my approval." Richard's face went completely blank, the expression he adopted when thoroughly confused. "What are you talking about? You're not a shareholder." William rose from his seat, buttoning his suit jacket in a gesture of formality. "Actually, Richard, that's the purpose of this emergency session. Allow me to formally introduce Elaine Carter, the founder and sole owner of Phoenix Ventures, which holds a 58% controlling interest in Growth Curve Technologies." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at me, then at William, his face gradually draining of color as the implications registered. Around the table, board members exchanged glances ranging from confusion to dawning comprehension. "That's not possible," Richard finally said, his voice unnaturally flat. "Phoenix is run by—" He trailed off, apparently realizing he had never actually met the person he believed controlled his company's destiny. "By me," I completed his sentence, moving past him to take the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, directly facing his seat of assumed authority. Phoenix Ventures was created 5 years ago with my inheritance from my grandmother. William has been representing my interests as the primary shareholder since the initial investment. Harriet Mills, always quick with numbers, was the first to recover. "The $12 million that saved us from bankruptcy," she said, her eyes widening as connections formed. "That was your money?" "Yes," I confirmed, placing my portfolio on the table with deliberate care. "Every quarterly report, every performance review, every strategic decision requiring majority shareholder approval has been overseen by me through Phoenix Ventures." Richard remained standing, his body rigid with shock. "This is some kind of joke," he said, though his expression showed he was already processing the truth. How could you do this without telling me?" "You needed funding," I replied simply. "You wouldn't have taken it if you knew it came from me. Your pride wouldn't allow it. So I created a structure that would protect both our financial future and your ego." The board members were watching this exchange with expressions ranging from fascination to discomfort. Corporate governance had suddenly become marital drama, and no one quite knew the protocol. "Perhaps," offered Gordon Wells, the eldest board member, "we should reschedule this meeting to allow for some private discussion between Mr. and Mrs. Carter?" "That won't be necessary, Gordon," I said, opening my portfolio to retrieve copies of the documents I had prepared. "Richard and I have already had our private discussion. 2 nights ago, at our anniversary dinner, he informed me that he's leaving our marriage for his executive assistant." I nodded toward Vanessa, who seemed to be trying to physically shrink into the background. "So, while the timing might seem dramatic, I assure you it's merely coincidental." Richard finally found his voice again, anger now displacing shock. "You've been lying to me for 5 years, he hissed, leaning forward with his hands braced on the table. "Playing some twisted game, pretending to be a silent investor while manipulating my company behind my back." "Your company?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Richard, without my investment, there would be no company. You were 3 weeks from complete bankruptcy. Your initial business model was flawed, your market strategy was unfocused, and your burn rate was unsustainable. Phoenix Ventures, which is to say I saved Growth Curve Technologies, and for 5 years, I've continued protecting that investment." William cleared his throat, ever the voice of procedural correctness. "Perhaps we should focus on the business at hand. As stated in the meeting agenda, we need to discuss and approve the funding structure for European expansion." Richard stared at him with newfound hostility. "You, my wife's brother. You've been reporting to her all this time, feeding her information about my company." "About our company," William corrected mildly. "And yes, as Phoenix Ventures representative, I've kept the majority shareholder fully informed, as is my fiduciary responsibility." I watched Richard's face as the full implications sank in. Every boardroom victory he had claimed as his own strategic brilliance, every difficult decision that had somehow resolved in the company's favor, every funding approval that had arrived, just when needed, all had been influenced or directly orchestrated by me, the wife he had dismissed as merely supportive, the woman he had discarded for someone younger. "This changes nothing," he finally declared, reclaiming his seat with forced composure. "I'm still CEO. Day-to-day operations are still under my control." "For now," I agreed, my tone pleasant but firm. "The shareholder agreement does indeed give you operational authority, conditional upon performance standards and board approval." I paused, allowing him to absorb this reminder of his tenuous position. "Now, shall we proceed with the actual business of this meeting? The European expansion won't fund itself." As the meeting reluctantly shifted to its official agenda, I observed the subtle realignment of power around the table. Board members who had previously directed their comments primarily to Richard now glanced at me before speaking. Harriet's financial projections, always meticulous, were suddenly presented with extra attention to detail. Even Derek, who had always been Richard's strongest ally on the technical side, seemed to be re-evaluating his alliances in real time. Richard participated mechanically, his earlier confidence replaced by a wary calculation that I recognized from our most difficult marital negotiations. He was plotting, assessing options, looking for leverage. Across the table, I could almost see the wheels turning behind his eyes. How could he turn this situation to his advantage? How could he regain control? What Richard failed to realize was that the game had fundamentally changed. He was no longer playing against a wife who might be persuaded by emotional appeals or manipulated through shared history. He was facing a majority shareholder with legal authority to determine the company's future, and by extension, his own. As the meeting concluded, I watched Richard exchange a quick, anxious glance with Vanessa, who had remained silent throughout, taking notes with her head bowed. I wondered if she was reconsidering the wisdom of hitching her future to a man whose own position had just been revealed as far more precarious than anyone had realized. "He'll try to force a buyout," William predicted as our town car navigated the afternoon traffic back to Greenwich. "Richard won't be able to stand working under your authority, especially now." I gazed out the window at the passing scenery, considering this assessment. Possibly. But he'd need financing to buy my shares, and those shares are worth considerably more than he can raise on his own. William's reflection in the window looked troubled. "Don't underestimate him, Elaine. Richard is nothing if not resourceful, and he has connections throughout the industry." "Connections built on a reputation that just took a significant hit," I pointed out. "Word will spread quickly that he wasn't the financial mastermind everyone believed, that his success was largely due to his wife's investment and guidance." "Which might make him even more desperate," William countered. "Cornered animals are the most dangerous." I turned from the window to face my brother directly, appreciating his concern but finding it unnecessary. "William, for the first time in 5 years, I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not. Do you have any idea how liberating that feels?" The tension in his expression eased slightly. "I can imagine. But liberation doesn't equal victory, not yet. We need a comprehensive strategy." "We have one," I assured him, patting the portfolio in my lap. "We've been developing it for years, whether we realized it or not." Back at the house, I declined William's offer to stay. I needed solitude to process the morning's events and to prepare for what would come next. The confrontation had unfolded, largely as anticipated, but Richard's reaction, the naked shock and subsequent calculation in his eyes, had affected me more than I'd expected. Not because I pitied him, but because I recognized his vulnerability for the first time in our relationship. I changed out of my business attire into comfortable loungewear and carried a glass of Pinot Noir into my home office. The room had always been my private domain, the one space Richard rarely entered. Now it would become command central for the restructuring of my life. Settling behind my desk, I opened my laptop and began drafting a series of emails, first to Diane, providing a detailed account of the board meeting, then to my financial advisor, requesting a complete review of my non-growth curve investments, And finally, to Patricia, my closest friend, briefly explaining the separation and asking for discretion until matters were settled. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "We need to talk. Privately. Tonight." I considered ignoring it but decided against creating unnecessary animosity. "Professional matters should be addressed through appropriate channels," I replied. "Personal matters through our respective attorneys." His response came quickly. 20 years of marriage deserves more than legal intermediaries. A reasonable point, but also classic Richard manipulation, appealing to sentiment when logic failed him. I set the phone aside without responding and returned to my strategic planning. The legal aspects of our separation were straightforward, protected by the prenuptial agreement and my ownership structure and growth curve. The business aspects were more complex. As William had noted, Richard would likely seek ways to neutralize my control or force me out entirely. I needed to anticipate and counter his potential moves. I pulled up Growth Curve's organizational chart on my laptop, studying the executive team Richard had assembled. Harriet Mills, the CFO, was professionally conservative and fundamentally honest, a potential ally in maintaining financial transparency during this transition. Derek Johnson, the CTO, was brilliant but ethically flexible, loyal to Richard for giving him creative freedom with the product development team. The rest of the executive leadership consisted of Richard's carefully selected subordinates, people who owed their positions to his patronage. Lower in the organization were the true innovators and workhorses, the engineers, data scientists, and client relationship managers who made Growth Curve's technology valuable in the marketplace. These employees had no particular loyalty to Richard. Personally, they were committed to the company's mission and their own professional advancement. Their continued engagement would be crucial to maintaining Growth Curve's market position during any leadership turbulence. I created a spreadsheet, methodically mapping each key employee's potential reaction to the revelation of my ownership and to any conflict between Richard and myself. Next to each name, I noted leverage points. What they valued, what they feared, what might sway their allegiance one way or the other. This wasn't about vindictiveness. It was about protecting my investment and ensuring the company's stability. If Richard forced a power struggle, I needed to know who would stand where, and how to secure the support of those who mattered most to Growth Curve's continued success. My phone rang again. Richard, calling this time instead of texting. I let it go to voicemail, focusing instead on the next phase of my planning, client relationships. Growth Curve's client base included major retailers, financial institutions, and healthcare systems that used our predictive analytics to optimize operations and customer engagement. Many of these relationships had been personally cultivated by Richard, who excelled at the charismatic aspects of business development. In the event of a visible leadership conflict, these clients might become nervous about the company's stability. I drafted a communication plan, identifying key clients who should receive personal outreach from board members, preferably not Richard, to reassure them of Growth Curve's solid financial position and continued commitment to their success. William could coordinate this effort, leveraging the relationships he had built as Phoenix Ventures representative. The voicemail notification appeared on my phone. With a sigh, I played Richard's message. "Elaine, this is absurd. We need to talk face to face. What happened at the board meeting today? You blindsided me in front of my entire executive team. That was calculated humiliation, and you know it. Whatever issues exist between us personally, Growth Curve is my life's work. I built this company from nothing. You may have provided capital, but I provided the vision, the leadership, the daily commitment that made it successful. We need to find a way forward that acknowledges both contributions. Call me back, please." His tone shifted from indignation to persuasion to something almost like pleading by the end, an emotional journey that the old Elaine might have found compelling. The new Elaine simply noted the tactical approach and continued her planning. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, drawing my attention to the fading daylight. I had been working for hours without pause, constructing a comprehensive defense of my interests. Now I needed perspective, distance from the immediate situation to consider longer-term implications. I moved to the kitchen and prepared a simple dinner, taking it out to the terrace where Richard and I had so often entertained guests on summer evenings. The solitude felt strange, but not unwelcome. As I ate, I contemplated not just the mechanics of protecting my ownership in Growth Curve, but what I truly wanted from this new chapter of my life. Did I want to remain actively involved in the company's operations? Did I want to force Richard out completely, replacing him with new leadership? Or did I simply want to ensure my financial interests were protected while I pursued other opportunities? The questions were larger than revenge, more complex than the immediate satisfaction of seeing Richard's shock when I revealed myself as Phoenix Ventures. They touched on fundamental aspects of my identity that had been subsumed in my marriage. Ambitions, set aside, talents directed toward supporting Richard's dreams rather than creating my own. My phone buzzed again. Not Richard this time, but Diane. "Just checking in," her text read. "How are you holding up after the board meeting?" "Strategizing," I replied. "Mapping stakeholders and planning contingencies. As expected. But take care of yourself too. Divorce is emotional even when approached logically." Her concern was professional but genuine, reminding me that while business strategy was familiar territory, the personal dimensions of this separation would require their own kind of attention. I couldn't simply spreadsheet my way through the dissolution of a 20-year marriage, no matter how justified I felt in protecting my interests. As if to underscore this reality, my sister Caroline called just as I was clearing away my dinner dishes. "Elaine," she said when I answered, "William told me what happened. Are you all right? Do you want me to come over?" Caroline, 5 years, younger and perpetually concerned about everyone in her orbit, had never quite understood my pragmatic approach to life's challenges. Where I saw problems to be solved, she saw emotions to be processed. "I'm fine, Caroline," I assured her. "Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm focused." "But you must be heartbroken," she insisted. 20 years, Elaine, and to leave you for his assistant. It's such a pathetic cliché." I leaned against the kitchen counter, considering her perspective. The cliché hurts more than the loss, honestly. That someone I respected could be so predictable in his midlife crisis. "See? You are hurt," Caroline pounced on the admission. "You don't have to be the strong one all the time, you know. It's okay to fall apart a little." "I don't have time to fall apart," I replied, more sharply than intended. Softening my tone, I added, "But I appreciate your concern. Really. I'm just not built for dramatic breakdowns. At least promise me you'll come to dinner this weekend," she pressed. "The kids miss their aunt, and Daniel's grilling that salmon you like." The normalcy of family dinner beckoned, a reminder that life continued beyond the current crisis. "Sunday might work," I conceded. "I'll let you know." After ending the call, I returned to my office with fresh perspective. Caroline was right about one thing. There was an emotional dimension to this situation that I couldn't simply strategize away. Richard's betrayal hurt. The years invested in our marriage mattered. The public humiliation of being left for a younger woman stung my pride. But unlike many in my position, I had something beyond emotion to focus on. Concrete leverage that would determine not just the financial outcomes of our divorce, but the future of Richard's professional identity. The company he believed defined him was, in fact, more mine than his. This realization crystallized my next steps. Opening a new document on my laptop, I outlined 3 parallel strategies. First, a defensive approach to protect my controlling interest in Growth Curve from any attempts by Richard to dilute or challenge it. This would involve legal reinforcements of the existing shareholder agreement, activation of hitherto unused governance provisions, and strategic communication with board members to ensure their understanding of where true authority rested. Second, an operational strategy to maintain growth curve's market position and financial performance during this period of leadership tension. This would require careful management of key client relationships, strategic reassurance of valuable employees, and transparent communication with investors about the company's stable foundation despite personal changes among leadership. And, third, this one giving me particular satisfaction to formulate, a contingency plan for Richard's eventual departure from Growth Curve Technologies. Not an immediate forced resignation, which might destabilize the company, but a carefully orchestrated transition that would leave him professionally adrift while preserving the business he thought he had built. As I refined these strategies late into the evening, my phone remained silent. Richard had apparently given up his attempts at direct communication for the night. This temporary reprieve allowed me to work uninterrupted, transforming raw plans into actionable steps, complete with timelines and responsibility assignments. By midnight, I had a comprehensive roadmap for the coming weeks, a strategy not just for surviving Richard's betrayal, but for thriving despite it. The woman who had once subordinated her financial acumen to her husband's ego had fully reclaimed her power, and she would not relinquish it again. I saved my work, closed my laptop, and prepared for bed with a sense of purpose that overwhelmed any lingering sorrow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Richard recovered from his initial shock and began plotting his counterattack, but for the first time in 20 years, I would meet those challenges not as Richard Carter's supportive wife, but as Elaine Carter, majority shareholder of Growth Curve Technologies and architect of her own destiny. Richard's counterattack came sooner than I expected. At 7:14 the next morning, my phone lit up with a call from Harriet Mills, Growth Curve's CFO. "Elaine," she began without preamble, her normally composed voice tense. "Richard called an executive leadership meeting for 8 a.m. He's positioning it as a strategy session to address the new ownership revelation and its impact on operations." I moved to my closet, already shifting mentally to select appropriate battle attire while keeping Harriet on speaker. "And you're calling to let me know because he specifically said not to inform Phoenix Ventures representatives," she replied, lowering her voice although she was presumably alone. "He told his assistant to coordinate with everyone except William." "I see," I said, selecting a crimson Armani suit that I knew projected confidence and authority. "Thank you for the information, Harriet. Your professional integrity is noted and appreciated." "I'm not taking sides," she clarified quickly. "I just believe in transparent corporate governance. If majority ownership is changing, the executive team needs clear direction about lines of authority." "Of course," I assured her, recognizing the careful position she was establishing. Complete neutrality is exactly what Growth Curve needs from its financial leadership right now. After ending the call, I immediately phoned William, catching him as he was leaving for his morning workout. "Cancel your plans," I instructed. "Richard's making his first move, an executive leadership meeting at 8 a.m., specifically excluding Phoenix representatives." William's sharp intake of breath communicated his understanding of the implications. "That's aggressive. What's your counter move?" "We're attending, of course," I replied, already laying out accessories to complement my chosen outfit. "But first, I need you to call Gordon Wells and Sumitra Patel from the board. They need to be there too." "On what grounds?" William asked. "This sounds like an operational meeting, not governance." "On the grounds that Richard is attempting to create a narrative about ownership transition without the owners present," I explained. "Gordon and Sumitra are the most senior independent board members. They need to witness whatever Richard is planning." "He'll be furious," William noted, though I could hear him already typing messages on his phone. "That's rather the point," I replied. "Now, meet me at Growth Curve in 45 minutes. We're going to leverage Richard's first mistake." As I dressed, I considered Harriet's call with greater attention. Her decision to inform me wasn't just professional ethics, it was a calculated positioning on her part. The CFO was hedging her bets, establishing value to both sides of a potential power struggle. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking I would expect from someone who had survived multiple corporate restructurings throughout her career. I arrived at Growth Curve headquarters at 7:50 a.m., deliberately early, and found William waiting in the lobby. He wore his most authoritative dark suit and carried an expensive leather portfolio that projected serious business intent. "Gordon and Sumitra are on their way," he confirmed as we stepped into the executive elevator. "Richard doesn't know yet." "Perfect," I said, adjusting my grandmother's sapphire ring. "When we enter the conference room, let me take the lead. Don't react to whatever Richard says initially. Let him overplay his hand." The executive team was already assembled in the main conference room when we arrived. Harriet Mills, Derek Johnson, Sanjay Gupta, the Chief Marketing Officer, Elena Rodriguez, Head of Client Relations, and Thomas Bennett, VP of Operations. Richard stood at the head of the table, a position that was beginning to seem more habitual than earned. He froze mid-sentence when he saw us. "Elaine, William." His surprise quickly hardened into something colder. "This is an internal operational meeting. I don't recall extending an invitation." I smiled pleasantly, selecting a chair directly opposite him. "As majority shareholder, I don't actually require an invitation to company meetings, Richard. Particularly ones specifically organized to discuss ownership matters." William took a seat beside me, his expression professionally neutral despite the tension crackling in the air. Richard placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "This meeting is to reassure the executive team about continuity of leadership despite yesterday's revelations. It's an operational necessity, not a governance issue. Any discussion about company leadership that deliberately excludes the majority owner is, by definition, a governance issue," I countered smoothly. "But please, don't let us interrupt. You were saying?" Before Richard could respond, the door opened again to admit Gordon Wells and Sumitra Patel. Gordon, in his 70s, with the distinguished silver hair and confident bearing of old money, nodded cordially to everyone. Sumitra, a brilliant former tech executive who had joined our board after a successful exit from her own startup, surveyed the room with sharp, analytical eyes. "Gordon, Sumitra," Richard managed, his composure visibly straining. "I wasn't expecting board representation at this operational discussion. When William mentioned an emergency meeting about ownership transition strategies, we felt it prudent to attend," Gordon replied mildly, though his emphasis on ownership transition made it clear he understood the subtext perfectly. Richard shot a venomous look at William before recovering his professional demeanor. "Of course, all input is valuable as we navigate this unusual situation." I watched the executive team exchanging glances, silently gauging the shifting power dynamics. This was corporate theater at its most consequential, and everyone in the room knew their careers might depend on correctly reading the prevailing winds. "Perhaps," I suggested, "we should clarify what this unusual situation actually is, to ensure everyone has accurate information." Richard recognized the trap, but had no choice except to walk into it. Yesterday's board meeting revealed that my wife, Elaine, is the previously anonymous investor behind Phoenix Ventures, which holds majority ownership in Growth Curve. This revelation coincides with changes in our personal relationship, creating potential leadership complications that we need to address professionally. "Changes in your personal relationship," I repeated, allowing just enough emphasis to highlight the euphemism. "You mean your decision to end our 20-year marriage for a relationship with your executive assistant. I believe context matters when discussing potential leadership complications." Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Elena Rodriguez, always the most emotionally intuitive of the team, looked particularly pained by the direct reference to Richard's infidelity. Derek Johnson studied his tablet with sudden intense interest. "Our personal matters aren't relevant to this discussion," Richard insisted, though his slight flush suggested otherwise. "On the contrary," Sumitra interjected, her precise, accented English carrying the authority of someone unused to being contradicted. "When personal relationships impact corporate leadership, they become business matters, particularly when they involve direct reporting lines within the organization." She glanced pointedly toward the door, through which Vanessa would normally have entered with Richard. Richard recognized he was losing control of the narrative. "The purpose of this meeting is to assure everyone that despite these complications, Growth Curve's operations will continue smoothly. I remain CEO, fully committed to our strategic objectives and growth targets." "While operational continuity is indeed crucial," I said, opening my portfolio and distributing printed documents to everyone at the table, "I believe we should address the governance questions first. What I've provided is a summary of the shareholder agreement that has governed Phoenix Ventures' relationship with Growth Curve Technologies for the past 5 years. As the executives reviewed the document, I continued. You'll note in Section 4.3 that the majority shareholder, Phoenix Ventures, which is now publicly identified as me, has approval rights over all executive leadership appointments, compensation, structures, and significant operational decisions. This has always been the case, though previously exercised through William as my representative. Richard's jaw tightened as he skimmed the highlighted sections. These provisions were designed for extraordinary circumstances, not day-to-day management. Actually, William corrected gently, they've been actively used throughout Growth Curve's development. Every executive hire, including Vanessa Winters, was approved through these provisions. Every compensation package, including your most recent raise, Richard, was reviewed and authorized under this framework. I watched understanding dawn across the faces around the table. The executive team was realizing that their careers had been shaped not just by Richard's decisions, but by an invisible hand they hadn't known existed. My hand. The point, I continued, is not to disrupt operations, but to clarify authority. Growth Curve has thrived under this governance structure for 5 years. The only difference now is transparency about who holds the controlling interest. And the fact that the controlling interest is now divorcing the CEO, Richard added sharply. I nodded, acknowledging this reality, which creates potential conflicts that need to be managed through proper governance channels, hence the presence of independent board members today. Gordon, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. I believe what we need is a formal operating protocol for this transitional period. Clear delineation of decision-making authority, transparent communication channels, and perhaps some temporary adjustments to reporting structures. He glanced meaningfully toward the door, his implication about Vanessa's position clear. Sumitra nodded in agreement. I've guided companies through leadership transitions before. The key is establishing clear boundaries while maintaining operational momentum. She turned to Richard directly. It would be prudent to temporarily reassign your assistant to another executive until personal matters are resolved. Richard's expression darkened, but he was too experienced to openly challenge such reasonable governance recommendations from respected board members. I'll take that under advisement, he managed. Actually, I interjected, sliding another document. Across the table, I've drafted a proposed transitional governance framework that addresses these concerns. You'll find it includes temporary reassignment of certain personnel, establishment of a special governance committee comprising independent board members, and clear protocols for decisions requiring majority shareholder approval during this period. The document represented hours of work from the previous evening, leveraging my intimate knowledge of corporate governance and my specific understanding of Growth Curve's operations. It was comprehensive, professionally formatted, and, most importantly, difficult to reasonably object to without appearing obstructionist. As the executive team and board members reviewed the proposal, I watched Richard struggling to maintain his composure. He had called this meeting to assert control, to present himself as the steady hand guiding the company through unexpected turbulence. Instead, he found himself outmaneuvered by the very woman he had underestimated for 20 years. "This seems quite thorough," Harriet observed, her financial mind naturally drawn to the clear accountability structures outlined in the document. "The special committee provision is particularly appropriate given the circumstances." "I agree," Sumitra added. "This provides necessary guardrails without impeding operational effectiveness." Richard recognized defeat in this round, but attempted to salvage some authority. "I'll need time to review these recommendations in detail before implementation. As CEO, I have a responsibility to ensure any governance changes support our strategic objectives." "Of course," I conceded graciously. "The board's governance committee can convene tomorrow to formally consider adoption. In the meantime," I added, turning to the executive team, "I want to assure everyone that Growth Curve's mission and strategy remain unchanged. My financial commitment to the company's success is as strong as ever. It always has been, though previously through Phoenix Ventures." Gordon, with the perfect timing of an experienced corporate diplomat, stood to signal the meeting's conclusion. "I believe this has been a productive first step in establishing appropriate protocols for the transition period. Richard, Elaine, thank you both for your commitment to handling this situation professionally." As the meeting dispersed, I remained seated, watching Richard gather his materials with short, angry movements that betrayed his frustration. When we were alone in the conference room, he finally spoke directly. "That was a masterclass in corporate maneuvering," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I didn't know you had it in you." "That's rather the point, isn't it?" I replied, gathering my own portfolio with unhurried precision. "You never bothered to know what I had in me. You were too busy building the myth of the self-made tech, visionary to notice that your success rested on someone else's foundation." "I built this company," he insisted, a familiar refrain that now sounded hollow even to his own ears, judging by the flicker of uncertainty that crossed his face. "We built this company," I corrected him, standing to leave. "My capital, your vision, William's guidance, the executive team's execution, the engineer's innovation. Growth Curve has always been a collective achievement. Your mistake was believing your own press releases." I walked to the door, then paused, to deliver one final observation. "By the way, Richard, Vanessa wasn't at this meeting. I wonder if she's already reconsidering her options now that your position seems less secure than advertised." The flash of doubt in his eyes confirmed my suspicion. Richard's relationship with Vanessa was as much about validation of his power and success as it was about her youth or beauty. If that power diminished, so might her interest. "This isn't over," he said, attempting to sound confident but achieving only petulance. "No," I agreed as I left the conference room. "It's just beginning." News travels quickly in corporate environments, particularly when the news involves power shifts at the executive level. By noon, the entire company was humming with carefully worded versions of what had transpired in the morning meeting. By evening, industry contacts were calling with thinly veiled inquiries about Growth Curve's leadership transition. By the following morning, 3 things had become abundantly clear. First, Richard's authority had been fundamentally undermined. Emails that previously would have prompted immediate action now received measured responses about reviewing with appropriate stakeholders. Decisions he might have made unilaterally were suddenly subject to committee discussions. Even his executive assistant, not Vanessa, who had been reassigned to marketing as per the governance protocol, but a hastily appointed replacement, seemed to approach his directives with newfound caution. Second, my revelations had created both uncertainty and opportunity throughout the organization. Ambitious directors who had previously aligned themselves with Richard as the path to advancement were recalculating their political alliances. Long overlooked managers whose ideas had been dismissed by Richard but supported by Phoenix Ventures, through William, were connecting the dots and reaching out with congratulatory messages, thinly disguising their desire to establish direct relationships with the now visible majority owner. And third, most satisfyingly, Vanessa's position had become increasingly awkward. Her reassignment to marketing, specifically to support Sanjay Gupta's team on the European expansion messaging, isolated her from Richard physically and organizationally. The transparent nature of her promotion from entry-level administrative assistant to Richard's executive aide just 3 months after joining the company now raised eyebrows that had previously been diplomatically lowered. I observed these developments, not from the sidelines but from a newly established office on the 31st floor of Growth Curve headquarters, one floor below the executive suite where Richard maintained his corner office. William had arranged the space, formerly a conference room used for client presentations, to be quickly converted into a suitable workspace for Phoenix Ventures' direct representation. On Thursday morning, 3 days after the initial board meeting revelation, I was reviewing European market penetration strategies when Elena Rodriguez, the head of client relations, requested a meeting. Elena had always been politely friendly during company functions, but never particularly warm. Her loyalty to Richard had seemed unwavering throughout her 5 years with Growth Curve. "Elaine," she began, settling into the chair opposite my desk. With practiced poise, "thank you for making time. I wanted to discuss the Berkshire Financial implementation personally." Berkshire Financial was Growth Curve's largest client, representing nearly 20% of annual recurring revenue. The implementation Elena referred to was a major expansion of their predictive analytics package, scheduled to launch in 6 weeks and critical to hitting quarterly revenue targets. "Of course," I replied, curious about her real purpose. "William mentioned they're concerned about potential disruption from our leadership. Adjustments." Elena nodded, her expression professionally concerned. "Their CIO called me directly yesterday. He was diplomatic, but the message was clear. They need reassurance about project continuity." "And Richard would normally provide that reassurance," I noted, watching her reaction carefully. She hesitated briefly before responding. "Typically, yes. But under the circumstances, I thought perhaps." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with directly suggesting that Richard might not be the right face for client confidence at the moment. "You thought perhaps the majority shareholder might better convey stability and commitment," I finished for her. "Exactly," she acknowledged, seeming relieved at my directness. "Berkshire has invited us to their headquarters tomorrow for a project review. Richard is scheduled to attend, but I wondered if you might consider joining as well, or possibly." "They're replacing him as the executive representative," I supplied, understanding the unspoken suggestion. Elena maintained her diplomatic composure, but her relief was evident. "The governance protocols you established do specify that client relationships of Berkshire's magnitude fall under the special committee's oversight during the transition period." I sat back, observing this first clear evidence of a key executive hedging her bets, or perhaps more accurately, recognizing where true authority now resided. Elena wasn't being disloyal to Richard precisely. She was prioritizing company interests and client relationships over personal allegiances. It was exactly the kind of professional judgment I would expect from someone in her position. "I appreciate your bringing this directly to my attention," I said, making a quick decision. "You're right that Berkshire's confidence is paramount. I'll attend tomorrow's meeting with you. Please inform Richard that the Special Governance Committee has designated this a priority relationship requiring majority shareholder representation." The subtle shift in Elena's posture, a relaxing of tension she probably hadn't realized she was displaying, told me I'd made the right call. "Thank you. I'll update the meeting details and brief you on the specific concerns they've raised." After Elena left, I contacted William to discuss the implications of this development. "It's starting," I told him. "The realignment I expected." Elena just effectively invited me to supplant Richard in the Berkshire relationship. "Faster than I anticipated," William observed. "Have you heard from Diane about the divorce filing?" "We're holding until next week," I replied. "I want the governance protocols firmly established before adding that complication." "How are things on the financial side?" William's sigh carried through the phone. "Richard's requested comprehensive valuation materials for Growth Curve's assets and intellectual property. Harriet flagged it for me. He's bypassed normal channels and engaged external consultants. He's preparing for a buyout attempt," I concluded, unsurprised but irritated by the predictability of Richard's response. "Make sure Harriet understands that any external consultants require special committee approval under the new protocols." "Already handled," William confirmed. "The more interesting development is on the Vanessa front." I raised an eyebrow, though he couldn't see it. "Oh?" "Sanjay reports she's been remarkably professional since the reassignment. Focused, efficient, making insightful contributions to the European marketing strategy, almost as if she's positioning herself as valuable to the organization beyond her relationship with Richard," I finished, understanding immediately. Smart move on her part. "Also," William added, his tone suggesting he'd saved the most interesting detail for last, "she's requested a meeting with you tomorrow." That was unexpected. Did she indicate the purpose? "Professional development opportunities," William replied, skepticism evident in his voice. "Specifically, she's interested in the European launch team. The European expansion represented Growth Curve's most significant growth opportunity, and a convenient relocation for someone looking to distance themselves from a complicated situation. Vanessa's request suggested a level of strategic thinking I hadn't given her credit for. Schedule her for 4:09 tomorrow, I decided, after the Berkshire meeting, but before my call with Gordon about the special committee recommendations. The following day brought further evidence of the shifting landscape at Growth Curve. When I arrived at headquarters, the receptionist, who had always been friendly but formal, greeted me with new deference. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. Your visitor badge has been replaced with a permanent executive credential," she explained, handing me a security card identical to those carried by the leadership team. "Mr. Wells from the board authorized it yesterday." In the elevator, two product managers who had never spoken directly to me before made a point of introducing themselves and mentioning projects they'd led that had received Phoenix Ventures support. Their eagerness to establish personal connections with the newly revealed majority owner was transparent, but understandable. Richard was conspicuously absent from the office that morning. According to his calendar, visible to the executive team, he was taking external meetings, vague enough to prompt speculation but plausible enough to avoid direct questioning. I suspected he was meeting with legal or financial advisors about his options, but I didn't waste energy wondering. My focus remained on the Berkshire meeting and the subsequent conversation with Vanessa. Elena met me in the lobby at 11 a.m., perfectly groomed in conservative business attire and carrying both a tablet and a leather portfolio. "Richard called Berkshire's CIO directly this morning," she informed me as we settled into the company car. "He explained that he had another commitment, but that you would be representing Growth Curve's leadership instead." The graceful exit surprised me slightly. I had expected Richard to fight harder to maintain his visible role with our largest client. That was professional of him, I acknowledged. Elena's expression remained carefully neutral. He emphasized, "Your role as majority shareholder and long-term strategic investor." After a brief pause, she added, "He didn't mention your personal relationship." Interesting. Richard was adapting more quickly than I'd anticipated, separating business considerations from personal grievances, at least publicly. Whether this represented strategic restraint or the beginning of acceptance remained to be seen. The Berkshire meeting proved remarkably productive. Their executive team, initially cautious, became increasingly engaged as I demonstrated detailed knowledge of their implementation and a clear commitment to its success. By the end of the 2-hour session, their CIO was openly discussing future expansion opportunities beyond the current project scope. "You've been more involved in the technical details than we realized, Mrs. Carter," he commented as we concluded. "Phoenix Ventures has always maintained active oversight of key client implementations," I replied smoothly. "The only change is that now you're speaking directly with me rather than through representatives." Elena, who had watched the dynamics shift throughout the meeting, added, "Elaine's financial background gives her a unique perspective on how our analytics drive business outcomes for financial institutions like Berkshire." The subtle repositioning was masterful, establishing me not as Richard's replacement, but as the previously hidden expert finally taking her rightful place in client relationships. Elena was proving herself remarkably adaptable to the new power structure. Back at Growth Curve headquarters, I had just settled into my office when Harriet Mills requested an unscheduled meeting. The CFO entered with less than her usual composure, clutching a folder with uncharacteristic tension. "We have a situation," she announced without preamble. "Richard has approached 3 venture capital firms about potentially financing a management buyout of Phoenix Ventures' stake in Growth Curve." I kept my expression neutral despite the internal spark of vindication. This was exactly the move I had anticipated. "I assume you learned this through official channels?" Harriet shifted uncomfortably. "Not exactly. The CFO at Meridian Capital is a former colleague. He called me directly, off the record, because he was concerned about potential governance implications. Apparently, Richard presented himself as having board support for exploring ownership restructuring. Which he doesn't, I noted calmly. "Precisely," Harriet confirmed, her professional concern evident. "As CFO, I can't have external financial entities receiving misrepresentations about our governance approvals. It creates regulatory exposure." What Harriet was really saying, beneath the corporate language, was that she was unwilling to risk her professional reputation by remaining silent about Richard's unauthorized outreach. Her decision to inform me directly represented another significant shift in the company's internal power dynamics. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," I said, making a quick strategic calculation. "Would you be comfortable documenting this conversation for the Special Governance Committee? They should be aware of any representations being made to potential investors without proper authorization." Harriet nodded, her relief visible. "I've already drafted a memo. I'll forward it to Gordon Wells as committee chair." After she left, I sat back in my chair, contemplating this development. Richard's approach to venture capital firms was predictable. His Hail Mary attempt to maintain control of his company. What was more telling was Harriet's response, a clear choice to align herself with governance protocols rather than with the CEO who had hired her 3 years earlier. By 4 p.m., when Vanessa arrived for our scheduled meeting, I had received texts from both William and Gordon confirming receipt of Harriet's memo and initiating appropriate responses to Richard's unauthorized financing explorations. The governance mechanisms we had established were functioning precisely as designed, creating accountability structures that Richard couldn't easily circumvent. Vanessa entered my office with visible nervousness, but admirable composure given the circumstances. At 31, she projected polished professionalism in a navy suit that managed to be both appropriate and stylish. The woman who had replaced me in Richard's affections was undeniably attractive, but what struck me most was the intelligence evident in her careful observation of her surroundings and her measured approach to a deeply awkward situation. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mrs. Carter," she began, taking the seat I indicated opposite my desk. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss my role at Growth Curve given the complicated circumstances." I studied her for a moment, noting both her discomfort and her determination to push through it. Let's be direct, Ms. Winters. You're in a professionally precarious position through choices that were at least partially yours. However, I'm interested in Growth Curve's success, not in personal vendettas. So tell me why you believe you should be considered for the European launch team. Her relief at my business-like approach was visible. I have relevant experience from my previous position at Global Tech, where I supported 2 international market entries. I'm fluent in French and conversational in German. Most importantly, I understand Growth Curve's analytics platform from both a technical and marketing perspective. She continued with a concise, well-prepared overview of her qualifications that revealed more depth than I had expected. Richard's interest in her might have begun with physical attraction, but she was clearly more capable than her initial assistant role had suggested. Your background is stronger than your current position would indicate, I observed when she finished. Why did you accept an entry-level role at Growth Curve if you had international business experience? A flash of something, discomfort perhaps, or calculation, crossed her features before she answered. The position offered direct exposure to executive leadership and the opportunity to learn Growth Curve's business model from the center. I saw it as a strategic entry point rather than a limitation. A diplomatic answer that neatly avoided addressing whether Richard had been the specific attraction. I decided to press further. And your rapid promotion to executive assistant after 3 months? Was that also strategic? Her composure wavered slightly. It was unexpected but welcome. I had demonstrated value in my initial role and was eager for increased responsibility. I allowed the diplomatic fiction to stand, more interested in her current positioning than in rehashing the obvious. Ms. Winters, let me be clear. Your personal relationship with Richard creates significant complications for your continued employment at Growth Curve, regardless of your qualifications. Why should I consider your request for the European team, rather than simply accepting your resignation? The bluntness of my question seemed to surprise her, but she recovered quickly. Because I'm good at what I do, and Growth Curve would benefit from my contributions to the European launch. Because I understand that my personal choices have created a problematic situation, and relocating to the London office would remove that daily complication for everyone involved. And because, she added with unexpected candor, I believe I deserve the opportunity to build a career based on my capabilities rather than being defined solely by a personal relationship. Her answer revealed both intelligence and a pragmatic assessment of her situation that I reluctantly respected. She wasn't pleading or apologizing, but making a business case for her continued value to the organization, albeit in a different location from both Richard and me. Your professional assessment is reasonable, I acknowledged. But tell me something, Ms. Winters. If you're relocated to London as part of the European team, what becomes of your relationship with Richard? She met my gaze directly for the first time. That's a personal matter that would need to be addressed between Richard and myself. From a professional standpoint, any relationship would comply fully with company policies regarding disclosure and reporting structures. A non-answer that told me everything I needed to know. Vanessa was already preparing her exit strategy, not from Growth Curve, but potentially from Richard himself. She had recognized which way the wind was blowing and was positioning herself for professional survival regardless of personal outcomes. I'll consider your request, I said finally. The European team selections will be finalized next week through the appropriate channels. In the meantime, continue your current assignments with marketing. After she left, I remained at my desk, contemplating the day's developments. In just 3 days, the power structure at Growth Curve had shifted dramatically. Key executives were realigning their loyalties. Major clients were accepting my authority. Richard was making desperate plays for financial backing that were being systematically exposed and contained by governance protocols. And even Vanessa, the catalyst for our marital implosion, was carefully recalculating her position. The first wave of consequences was rolling through growth curve exactly as I had anticipated. Richard's carefully constructed world, built on the foundation of my investment but claimed as his sole achievement, was being systematically reconfigured to reflect reality rather than ego. His authority was diminishing not through vindictive action on my part, but through the natural rebalancing that occurs when truth replaces fiction. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Divorce papers ready when you are. Judge Sanders can hear emergency motions on Monday if needed." I smiled slightly, feeling no particular urgency. The corporate consequences were unfolding so effectively that the legal formalities of ending our marriage seemed almost secondary. Richard was learning that losing me meant losing far more than just a wife. It meant losing the invisible support structure that had enabled his success for 20 years. "Hold until Tuesday," I texted back. "Let the weekend's developments play out first." As I gathered my things to leave for the day, Elena appeared in my doorway once more. "Berkshire's CIO just called," she reported, unable to completely hide her satisfaction. "They want to accelerate the implementation timeline and expand the initial scope by 30%. He specifically asked that you be involved in the revised planning sessions." Another piece falling into place, another relationship transferring from Richard to me, another validation of my strategic approach. "Schedule it for early next week," I replied. "And Elena, good work today." Her smile conveyed understanding of both the compliment and the evolving power structure she was successfully navigating. "The team is adapting quickly," she offered. "Change can be clarifying." Indeed it could, I reflected as I left the building. The first wave of consequences had revealed exactly who recognized genuine value and who had simply been responding to Richard's position. As those clarifications continued to ripple through the organization, Richard would find himself increasingly isolated, not because I had actively undermined him, but because his actual contributions were being distinguished from those he had appropriated from others. It was, perhaps, the most fitting consequence of all. The weekend brought no respite from the seismic shifts at Growth Curve. By Saturday morning, industry blogs had picked up whispers of leadership realignment at the analytics firm. By Sunday afternoon, a tech publication had published a speculative piece titled "Growth Curve Technologies: The Hidden Power Behind the Throne Revealed." While the article contained several inaccuracies, claiming I had been a silent co-founder rather than an investor who came in during year 3, its central premise was correct. The company's success had never been solely Richard's achievement. I spent Saturday morning at my favorite cafe downtown, the kind of simple pleasure I had often sacrificed during my marriage to accommodate Richard's preference for exclusive country club brunches. Over a perfectly adequate cappuccino and almond croissant, I reviewed the week's developments with clinical detachment, making notes on my next strategic moves. My phone buzzed with a text from William. "Richard just called Gordon, requesting emergency board meeting Monday to address governance concerns. Gordon's asking how you want to proceed." I considered the implications. An emergency board meeting suggested Richard had found, or believed he had found, some leverage to counter my control. Perhaps legal advice about challenging the shareholder agreement, or a potential investor willing to back his buyout attempt despite the governance committee's opposition. "Tell Gordon to approve the meeting," I responded. 4 p.m. Monday. "Want to see what Richard thinks is his winning move." William's reply came quickly. "Are you sure? Giving him the forum might legitimize whatever he's planning." "I'm sure," I texted back. "Better to let him show his hand in a controlled environment where we can respond immediately than have him working back channels." Sunday brought another interesting development. Patricia, my closest friend, called to report an unexpected encounter at La Maison, an upscale French restaurant favored by Greenwich's social elite. "You won't believe who I saw having an intense conversation in the corner booth," she began, without preamble. "Enlighten me," I replied, though I had my suspicions. "Richard and Thomas Blackwood," she said, confirming my guess. They were huddled over documents, speaking too quietly for anyone to overhear, but body language suggested serious business rather than social catching up. Thomas Blackwood was the managing partner at Blackwood Capital, a mid-sized private equity firm specializing in technology acquisitions. More relevantly, he was also a long-standing member of the same exclusive golf club as Richard, one of the old boys network connections Richard had cultivated throughout his career. That's interesting timing, I observed, making a mental note to alert William about this potential source of buyout funding. How did Richard look? Patricia, never one to miss social nuances, considered the question carefully. Intense, focused, but also diminished somehow. His usual command presence seemed muted. Blackwood was controlling the conversation, not Richard. The detail was revealing. Richard had always dominated social and professional interactions through sheer force of personality. If he was deferring to Blackwood, he was likely in the supplicant position, seeking financial backing rather than confidently negotiating terms. Thanks for the intelligence, I told Patricia. It's helpful to know who Richard's approaching for support. That's what friends are for, she replied warmly. Though I must say, watching you outmaneuver Richard has become my favorite spectator sport. Half of Greenwich is talking about it, you know. I winced slightly at the reminder that our private drama had become public entertainment. I'd prefer they weren't. Well, that's not how it works when powerful couples separate, she pointed out pragmatically, especially when the separation reveals surprising power dynamics that challenge everyone's assumptions about the relationship. She wasn't wrong. Our social circle had always viewed me as the supportive corporate wife, the elegant hostess who facilitated Richard's networking and managed our social calendar. The revelation that I had been the financial force behind his success and was now asserting control of his company upended a narrative many had accepted unquestioningly for years. Monday morning brought another piece of the puzzle into focus. Diane called as I was leaving for the office, her tone suggesting important developments. Richard's attorney filed emergency motions this morning, she reported. He's challenging the validity of Phoenix Ventures' investment structure, claiming you violated fiduciary duty by not disclosing your identity to the board at the time of investment. I had anticipated this move. It was the obvious legal angle to pursue. We've discussed this, Diane. The investment structure was reviewed by 3 separate law firms before implementation. There was no legal requirement for Phoenix to disclose the identity of its beneficial owner. Correct, she confirmed. And I've already filed our response highlighting those facts. But there's more. He's also requesting temporary injunctive relief preventing you from making any operational changes at Growth Curve, pending resolution of the ownership dispute. That was more concerning. While unlikely to succeed on legal merits, such a motion could create uncertainty that might destabilize client and employee confidence. Timeline for the hearing? Judge Sanders has agreed to hear arguments Wednesday morning, Diane replied. I'm fully prepared, but you should know this is just the opening salvo. Richard's attorney is Lawrence Keller, aggressive, high profile, specializes in contentious business divorces. The choice of attorney was revealing. Keller was known for scorched earth litigation tactics and astronomical fees, a desperate move by Richard, suggesting he was willing to spend whatever necessary to regain control. Keep me updated on any developments, I instructed Diane. And send me the full filing. I want to see exactly what claims they're making. At Growth Curve headquarters, I arrived to find a subtle but noticeable shift in the office atmosphere. Conversations hushed as I passed, expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Word of Richard's legal challenge had clearly spread through internal channels, creating new uncertainty after a week of rapid adjustment to the new power reality. Elena intercepted me before I reached my office, her professional composure slightly strained. We've received 3 client calls this morning asking about the leadership dispute mentioned in industry blogs, she reported, falling into step beside me. The Berkshire implementation team is particularly concerned about potential delays. Draft a client communication addressing the speculation directly, I instructed. Emphasize that operational continuity is guaranteed regardless of any legal posturing. Have William review it before distribution. She nodded, making notes on her tablet. Also, Derek Johnson has requested an urgent meeting with you. He seemed agitated. That was interesting. The CTO had been conspicuously neutral during the past week's developments, neither aligning himself with Richard nor seeking direct connection with me. His agitation suggested he had finally chosen a side, or been forced to. Tell him I can see him at 2:00, I decided. Before the board meeting, but late enough that I'll have to keep it brief. The morning passed in a blur of operational reviews and preparation for Richard's emergency board meeting. William joined me for lunch in my office, bringing updated financial projections and intelligence on Richard's movements. He's been meeting with the development team leads individually, William reported, spreading documents across my desk as we ate. Positioning himself as the defender of Growth Curve's technical vision against potential interference from financially focused ownership. I nodded, unsurprised by the tactic, attempting to build a coalition by framing this as visionary leadership versus cold financial calculations. Classic Richard. It's having limited success, William continued. The senior developers remember that Phoenix Ventures consistently supported their more innovative proposals, while Richard often focused on quick-win features for sales leverage. This aligned with my approach over the past 5 years. I had always recognized that Growth Curve's long-term value lay in technical innovation rather than short-term revenue optimization. Richard, perpetually focused on quarterly results that would burnish his CEO image, had often needed to be overruled through Williams' board influence when development resources were allocated. What about Thomas Blackwood? I asked, recalling Patricia's intelligence from Sunday. Any movement there? Williams' expression confirmed my suspicions before he spoke. Blackwood Capital has requested Growth Curve's complete financial records for the past 3 years. Harriet flagged it this morning. Apparently, Richard authorized the disclosure without governance committee approval. Another violation of the protocols, I noted, adding it to my mental list of Richard's increasingly desperate maneuvers. Have Gordon issue a formal reminder that all potential investment discussions require committee approval, and instruct Harriet to provide only publicly available financial information until properly authorized. Derek Johnson arrived precisely at 2 p.m., his usual casual tech executive attire, jeans and a button-down shirt, replaced by an actual suit, suggesting he viewed this conversation as formally significant. The CTO's nervous energy was immediately apparent as he took a seat across from my desk, his fingers drumming briefly against his thigh before he consciously stilled them. "Thank you for meeting with me, Elaine," he began, the use of my first name a departure from his previous careful formality. "I believe we need to discuss the European deployment architecture directly." I raised an eyebrow, sensing this wasn't his actual reason for requesting the meeting. "I've reviewed the technical specifications William shared. The cloud infrastructure seems appropriately scaled for projected demand." Derek nodded too quickly. "Yes, the baseline architecture is solid, but there are decisions about resource allocation that might become contentious given the current situation. You're concerned about conflict between Richard's technical priorities and mine," I translated, cutting through his diplomatic circumlocution. His relief at my directness was visible. "Exactly. The development team is receiving contradictory direction. Richard wants to accelerate feature deployment even if it means compromising some security protocols. The governance committee is emphasizing security compliance over speed to market. The team is caught in the middle." "And you're wondering which directive to follow," I concluded. Derek met my gaze directly for the first time. I'm wondering if I can continue effectively as CTO if the company's technical vision is becoming a battlefield for other conflicts. The subtext was clear. Derek was assessing whether to remain at growth curve or begin looking for opportunities elsewhere. As CTO, his departure would be significantly disruptive, particularly with the European expansion underway. His technical vision had been central to Growth Curve's competitive advantage since he joined 4 years ago. The governance protocols exist precisely to prevent operational disruption during this transition period, I reminded him. Any technical directive that hasn't been approved through proper channels should be escalated to the committee. With respect, Derek countered, showing more backbone than I'd previously observed. Governance protocols don't build software. Engineers need clear direction from unified leadership, not competing authorities citing different procedures. He had a valid point, one that reflected genuine concern for the company rather than political positioning. I decided to be equally direct. Derek, let me be clear. I have no intention of undermining Growth Curve's technical excellence or micromanaging development decisions. My priority as majority shareholder is the company's long-term success, which requires maintaining the innovative culture you've helped build. I paused, watching his expression carefully before continuing. However, Richard is currently attempting to leverage technical decisions as a proxy battle for control. You and your team shouldn't be collateral damage in that conflict. His posture relaxed slightly. I had acknowledged the reality he was navigating, rather than offering corporate platitudes. What specifically are you proposing? For the next 30 days, all technical decisions related to the European deployment will be reviewed by a special technical committee consisting of you, William as Phoenix's representative, and Elena to represent client requirements, I proposed. Richard will provide input but not have veto authority during this period. After 30 days, we reassess based on the resolution of current governance questions. Derek considered this compromise, his analytical mind visibly processing implications. That could work. It removes the development team from the crossfire while maintaining technical integrity. Exactly, I confirmed. I'll have the governance committee formalize this structure at today's meeting. Will that address your concerns sufficiently to keep you focused on innovation rather than politics? His slight smile acknowledged the directness of my question. Yes. Assuming the committee actually empowers technical decisions rather than creating another approval bottleneck. I'll ensure that's the case, I promised, standing to signal our meeting was concluding. Is there anything else we need to address before the board meeting? Derek hesitated briefly. For what it's worth, many of us have recognized over the past few years that the most technically sound decisions at Growth Curve often aligned with Phoenix Ventures' recommendations, not necessarily with Richard's initial directives. That pattern is becoming clearer in retrospect. The observation was offered not as flattery, but as professional acknowledgement, and it confirmed that the technical team was recognizing the true source of decisions that had protected their innovation priorities over the years. Thank you, Derek. That context is helpful, I replied simply. Let's make sure the European deployment maintains those high standards, regardless of current distractions. As he left, I had just enough time to review the emergency board meeting agenda William had forwarded before heading to the conference room. Richard had listed 3 items for discussion: governance protocol overreach, operational continuity concerns, and proposed mediation structure for ownership transition. The last item caught my attention. Ownership transition suggested Richard had moved beyond challenging my control to accepting it as reality, but was positioning for a managed exit rather than an outright defeat. It was a more sophisticated approach than I had expected, hinting that perhaps Blackwood had advised a strategic retreat rather than continued direct confrontation. I arrived at the board meeting deliberately 2 minutes late, not enough to be unprofessional, but sufficient to make a subtle point about who was controlling the timing now. Richard sat at his usual position at the head of the table, with Gordon Wells and Sumitra Patel to his right, and the remaining 3 board members. Completing the configuration, William had left a chair open beside him, opposite Richard's position of assumed authority. "Thank you all for accommodating this emergency session," Richard began as I took my seat, his tone professionally cordial despite the tension evident in his posture. "I've asked to convene the board to address several concerns about the implementation of the new governance protocols." What followed was a masterclass in corporate rhetoric. Richard eloquently outlined how the governance committee's oversight was allegedly creating operational inefficiencies, slowing decision-making, and potentially compromising Growth Curve's competitive advantages in the market. He cited specific examples of delayed approvals, questioned the necessity of board review for routine operational decisions, and emphasized the risk to client confidence if leadership appeared fragmented. It was a compelling performance, delivered with the charisma and conviction that had made Richard so effective as the public face of Growth Curve. Had I not been intimately familiar with the actual decisions he was mischaracterizing, I might have found myself sympathetic to his arguments. Gordon Wells, ever the seasoned corporate diplomat, allowed Richard to complete his presentation before responding. "These are valid concerns about operational efficiency, Richard. However, the governance protocols were established precisely because of unusual circumstances that required additional oversight." His diplomatic phrasing of my husband leaving me for his assistant was impressive in its understatement. "Circumstances which are being addressed through appropriate legal channels," Richard countered smoothly. "But Growth Curve's operations shouldn't be collateral damage while those matters resolve." It was time to redirect the conversation. "Perhaps," I suggested, "we should address the third agenda item directly. You've proposed a mediation structure for ownership transition. I'm interested in understanding exactly what you're suggesting, Richard." My direct approach clearly caught him off guard. He had planned to build his case methodically before revealing his proposed solution. Nevertheless, he recovered quickly. "Yes, well, after considerable reflection, I believe the cleanest resolution would be a structured buyout of Phoenix Ventures' interest in Growth Curve," he stated, meeting my gaze directly for the first time since I'd entered the room. "I've secured potential funding partners who recognize the value of maintaining consistent leadership through our European expansion phase." "Blackwood Capital?" I asked innocently, noting his slight flinch at the revelation that I knew about his supposedly private negotiations. "Among others," he acknowledged, recovering. "The proposal would provide Phoenix Ventures, which is to say, you, Elaine, with a significant premium over current valuation, allowing for a clean separation of our business interests concurrent with our personal situation." The offer itself wasn't surprising, but the fact that he was presenting it as a magnanimous concession rather than the desperate maneuver it actually represented showed Richard's continued capacity for audacious framing. "And the proposed valuation for this generous buyout?" I inquired, my tone pleasant but firm. Richard slid a folder across the table. "The terms are outlined here. Essentially, a 15% premium over the last independent valuation, with structured payments over 3 years to optimize tax implications." I didn't bother opening the folder. The last independent valuation was conducted 18 months ago, before we secured the Berkshire expansion or finalized the European market entry strategy. Both significantly increase Growth Curve's current value. "The premium accounts for recent growth," Richard countered. "A 15% premium on an outdated valuation still represents a substantial discount to current market value," I responded calmly. "But more fundamentally, Richard, I haven't expressed any interest in selling my controlling interest in Growth Curve. Your proposal assumes an intention I haven't indicated." His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Given the circumstances, a clean separation of our business interests seems the most logical path forward for all parties." "For you, perhaps," I acknowledged. "But as majority shareholder, my primary obligation is to Growth Curve's success, not to Richard Carter's comfort level. The direct statement hung in the air, the subtext clear to everyone present. Richard wanted to buy me out because he couldn't tolerate working under my authority. But that discomfort was his problem, not mine or the company's. Sumitra Patel, never one for extended corporate posturing, cut to the heart of the matter. Richard, your proposal indicates you've been pursuing external financing without board knowledge or governance committee approval, contrary to the protocols established last week. That creates concerns about adherence to agreed governance structures. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Exploratory discussions with potential investors don't require formal approval until specific terms are being negotiated. Actually, William interjected, Section 4(2) of the governance protocols explicitly requires committee notification of any discussions regarding ownership changes, specifically to prevent exactly this type of unilateral action. The conversation continued in this vein for another 40 minutes, with Richard attempting various justifications for his buyout proposal and governance violations, while the board methodically identified the procedural and valuation flaws in his approach. Throughout, I maintained a composed, business-focused demeanor, never allowing the discussion to veer into personal territory despite Richard's occasional attempts to frame the situation as an unfortunate marital dispute impacting company operations. Finally, Gordon called for a vote on Richard's proposal to modify the governance protocols. It failed 5-2, with only Richard himself and one longtime ally supporting the changes. His proposed buyout structure was similarly rejected as procedurally inappropriate and substantially undervalued. As the meeting concluded, Richard remained seated while others gathered their materials to leave. When only he, William, and I remained in the room, he finally dropped the corporate facade. "This isn't sustainable, Elaine," he said, his voice lower and more personal than it had been during the formal proceedings. "We can't run a company this way indefinitely." "I agree," I replied evenly, "which is why the governance committee will be reviewing leadership structure options at next week's regular board meeting. I suggest you prepare appropriate transition proposals if you wish to have input on that discussion." The implication was clear. Richard's position as CEO was now explicitly in question, not just subject to additional oversight. His face flushed with barely controlled anger. "You would actually push me out of my own company?" he demanded, the pretense of corporate decorum finally shattered. "No, Richard," I corrected him gently as I stood to leave. "I would hold the CEO of a company I own majority interest in accountable for their performance and judgment. The fact that you see that as personal rather than professional is precisely the problem." As William and I walked out, leaving Richard alone in the boardroom that had once been the stage for his corporate performances, the escalation of consequences was undeniable. What had begun as a shift in perceived authority had now become an explicit threat to Richard's position as CEO. His attempt to circumvent governance protocols through backroom deals with Blackwood had backfired spectacularly, further undermining his credibility with the board. The calculated humiliation he had inflicted by ending our marriage at our anniversary dinner was now being answered by the systematic dismantling of his professional identity. Not through vindictive action on my part, but through his own increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control he had never truly earned. "He'll make another move," William observed as we rode the elevator down to the lobby. "This defeat will only make him more determined." "I'm counting on it," I replied, a small smile forming. "The more desperately Richard fights, the more clearly everyone sees the truth about who really built Growth Curve's success." The escalation was proceeding exactly as I had anticipated, and Richard's next move would likely push him from professionally compromised to irreparably damaged. The first visible crack in Richard and Vanessa's relationship appeared on Wednesday morning, the day of the court hearing for Richard's emergency motions. I arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes early, accompanied by Diane and her associate. The marble-floored lobby was sparsely populated at 8:45 a.m., making it impossible to miss Richard standing near the elevators, engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation with Vanessa. Even from a distance, their body language told a story. Richard leaning in with the intensity he always displayed when trying to convince someone of something important, Vanessa's arms crossed defensively, her head slightly turned away as if physically rejecting his words. They hadn't noticed our arrival, giving me a moment to observe this unguarded interaction. "Interesting," Diane murmured beside me. I wasn't expecting his girlfriend to attend the hearing. "Neither was he, apparently," I replied, noting Richard's clear agitation. We moved closer, not intentionally eavesdropping, but unable to avoid hearing snippets of their increasingly heated exchange. "Told you I needed to focus on the marketing deliverables," Vanessa was saying, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "The European campaign timeline is already compressed." "This is more important," Richard insisted. "I need you here today." "For what purpose exactly?" she challenged. "I'm not your wife. I'm not your attorney. And as of last week's reassignment, I'm not even your assistant. My presence adds nothing except potentially confirming the exact narrative your lawyer is trying to contest." Her logic was impeccable and clearly unwelcome. Richard's face flushed with the particular mixture of anger and embarrassment I recognized from our most difficult marital disagreements, the expression he wore when someone dared to question his judgment. "This isn't about legal strategy," he said, lowering his voice as he noticed others in the lobby beginning to take interest in their disagreement. "This is about showing a united front. Presence matters." Vanessa's laugh held no humor. "A united front?" "Richard, I'm trying to salvage what's left of my professional reputation after being labeled the assistant who broke up the CEO's marriage. Do you have any idea what I'm dealing with in the office right now?" Their conversation halted abruptly as Richard noticed me standing with my legal team. His expression hardened into the corporate mask he wore for difficult negotiations, while Vanessa's face registered a complicated mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been relief at the interruption. "Elaine," Richard acknowledged, stiffly. "I see you've brought reinforcements." "Just appropriate counsel for a legal proceeding," I replied evenly. "Good morning, Vanessa. I understand the European marketing materials are progressing well. Sanjay mentioned your campaign concept has tested strongly with focus groups." My deliberate pivot to professional matters clearly caught her off guard. After a moment's hesitation, she responded with visible relief at the neutral topic. "Yes, the initial results are promising. We're refining messaging for the German market this week." Richard's gaze darted between us, obviously unsettled by this civilly professional exchange. Before he could redirect the conversation, a court officer appeared to inform us that Judge Sanders was ready to begin the hearing. "If you'll excuse me," Vanessa said quickly, "I should get back to the office. Those deliverables won't complete themselves." Without waiting for Richard's response, she turned and walked toward the exit, her posture rigid with barely contained tension. The hearing itself proceeded much as Diane had predicted. Judge Sanders, a no-nonsense jurist with 20 years of experience in complex commercial disputes, listened impassively as Richard's attorney, Lawrence Keller, presented their emergency motions with theatrical urgency. The legal arguments were precisely what we had anticipated. Claims that I had violated fiduciary duties by not disclosing my identity as Phoenix Ventures' owner, assertions that the current governance protocols constituted oppression of minority shareholders, and requests for injunctive relief preventing any changes to Growth Curve's management structure pending full litigation. Diane systematically dismantled each argument with the precise, fact-based approach that had earned her reputation. As Connecticut's premier divorce attorney, she presented documentation from 3 independent law firms confirming the legality of Phoenix Ventures' structure, cited multiple precedents establishing that the governance protocols were well within standard corporate practice for conflict situations, and methodically demonstrated that Richard's claims of emergency were not supported by any evidence of imminent, irreparable harm. Judge Sanders took only a 15-minute recess before returning with her ruling. All emergency motions denied, with costs assigned to the plaintiff. While she acknowledged that Richard was entitled to pursue his full legal claims through normal litigation channels, she found no basis for emergency intervention in what appeared to be standard corporate governance procedures implemented to address apparent conflicts of interest. Richard's expression remained stoically neutral throughout the ruling, but I noted the whitening of his knuckles as he gripped the edge of the counsel table. This public legal defeat, coming so quickly after his rebuff by the board, represented another significant blow to his carefully constructed image as the indomitable business leader. As we exited the courtroom, Richard brushed past me without acknowledgement, heading directly to where his attorney waited with several assistants. Their huddled conversation, marked by Richard's sharp gestures, suggested they were already plotting their next legal maneuver. "That went as well as we could have hoped," Diane observed as we walked toward the parking garage. The judge saw through the emergency pretense immediately. "Richard's never been good at disguising his true motivations," I replied, feeling an unexpected twinge of something almost like sympathy. 20 years of marriage had given me intimate knowledge of Richard's psychological patterns, the way his fear of losing control inevitably drove him to overreach, weakening his position further. "What do you think happened with the girlfriend?" Diane asked, her professional curiosity evident. That didn't look like a couple presenting a unified front. "Vanessa is recalculating her position," I observed. "She's intelligent enough to recognize that Richard's prospects are diminishing daily. She's creating professional distance to protect her own opportunities." "Cold," Diane commented, though her tone suggested approval of the pragmatic approach. "Strategic," I corrected. "She's doing exactly what any smart professional would do when they realize they've attached themselves to a sinking ship." Back at Growth Curve headquarters, I found William waiting in my office, his expression suggesting significant developments. "The European team selections were finalized during the hearing," he reported without preamble. "Sanjay recommended Vanessa for the lead marketing role in London, citing her campaign concept and language skills. The committee approved it unanimously. This was certainly interesting timing." "Was Richard consulted?" "He was informed as a courtesy after the decision," William replied. According to Sanjay, he was displeased but acknowledged the committee's authority under the governance protocols. So while Richard had been attempting to compel Vanessa's supportive presence at the courthouse, Growth Curve's governance committee had been approving her relocation to London, effectively separating her both professionally and geographically from the man she had chosen over me. The irony was delicious in its perfect symmetry. "When does she transition to the London office?" I asked, already calculating the implications for the ongoing power dynamics. 2 weeks, William confirmed. "The advance team is already securing workspace and accommodations. She'll be responsible for building the European marketing team from the ground up." It was an excellent opportunity for someone of Vanessa's experience level, a significant promotion that would establish her independent professional identity away from the shadow of her relationship with Richard. The fact that it also neatly removed her from the increasingly toxic environment at headquarters was surely not lost on anyone involved in the decision. "Has she accepted the position?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Enthusiastically," William confirmed. "She sent formal acceptance within an hour of notification." The speed of her response told its own story. Vanessa was grasping the professional lifeline with both hands, prioritizing career advancement over whatever personal promises Richard might have made when convincing her to participate in the destruction of my marriage. Later that afternoon, Elena appeared at my office door, her expression suggesting she brought significant intelligence. "Richard and Vanessa just had what could only be described as a scene in the break room on 32, she reported, closing the door behind her. While office gossip wouldn't normally merit my attention, The timing made this particularly relevant. What kind of scene? The kind where voices are kept low but body language shouts, Elena replied, settling into the chair opposite my desk. From what Morgan in accounting could overhear, Richard was questioning Vanessa's loyalty in accepting the London position without consulting him. She responded that her career decisions weren't subject to his approval. How did it end? I asked, genuinely curious about the dynamics between them now that their power imbalance was shifting. With Vanessa saying something along the lines of "This isn't what I signed up for," and walking away, Elena reported. Richard looked. Well, Morgan said she'd never seen the CEO that angry before. I nodded, processing this information in the context of everything else happening. Thank you for letting me know. While office relationships aren't normally my concern, anything affecting executive morale is relevant during this transition period. Elena's slight smile acknowledged the diplomatic framing of my interest. Of course. Purely professional information sharing. After she left, I sat back in my chair, contemplating the accelerating dissolution of Richard and Vanessa's relationship. What had begun as cracks was rapidly developing into unbridgeable fissures, predictable fault lines emerging under the pressure of Richard's diminishing professional stature and Vanessa's strategic repositioning. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Tom Blackwood just called Charles. Apparently, Richard missed their scheduled meeting this afternoon. Unusual for him to be so unprofessional. Charles was Patricia's husband, a commercial real estate developer who occasionally collaborated with Blackwood Capital on property acquisitions. His friendship with Thomas Blackwood gave Patricia access to business intelligence that often proved valuable. Very unusual, I replied. Richard's always been pathologically punctual for investor meetings. Charles thinks Blackwood is getting cold feet anyway, Patricia added. The court ruling this morning raised red flags about the investment thesis. Another financial avenue closing for Richard, the potential white knight investor recognizing that backing a CEO in open conflict with the majority shareholder represented unacceptable risk. Richard's options were narrowing by the hour. Thursday brought the most public manifestation of Richard and Vanessa's deteriorating relationship. I was in a strategy session with the client relations team when William texted an urgent message. Check your email. Tech Insider piece just published. Significant. Excusing myself briefly, I opened my email to find William had forwarded a just-published article from the influential technology blog. The headline made my breath catch. Exclusive. Growth Curve Technologies, leadership drama deepens as CEO's girlfriend accepts London role. The piece was surprisingly detailed, citing sources close to the company, who confirmed that Vanessa Winters, widely reported to be in a relationship with CEO Richard Carter, had accepted a senior marketing position in Growth Curve's new London office, effectively removing herself from the headquarters dynamics as control disputes continue between Carter and his estranged wife, revealed last week to be the company's majority owner. Most damaging was a quoted statement allegedly from Vanessa herself. My relationship with Richard Carter has unfairly overshadowed my professional contributions to Growth Curve Technologies. The London position represents an opportunity to establish my career based on merit rather than personal connections. I'm looking forward to building our European presence while leaving recent complications behind. Whether Vanessa had actually provided this statement or it had been constructed from various sources was almost irrelevant. The public positioning was crystal clear. She was separating herself professionally and personally from Richard, reframing their relationship as a complication to be left behind, rather than a love worth sacrificing a 20-year marriage for. When I returned to the strategy session, I found the team attempting to maintain professional focus while clearly distracted by the breaking news that was rapidly circulating through company channels. Elena caught my eye with a questioning look, silently asking how to handle the elephant now firmly established in the room. I'm sure you've all seen the Tech Insider article, I acknowledged directly. While the personal aspects aren't relevant to our work, the public nature of the discussion may impact client perception. Let's take 15 minutes to discuss appropriate talking points for client questions, then return to our scheduled agenda. This practical approach, acknowledging reality while maintaining professional focus, seemed to reassure the team. Their collective relief at having a concrete task to address the awkward situation was palpable. As the day progressed, Richard was notably absent from headquarters. His calendar, still visible to the executive team, showed all appointments canceled, with no explanation. By mid-afternoon, speculation was rampant throughout the company about both his absence and the Tech Insider article that everyone had now read. William joined me for a late coffee in my office, bringing updated intelligence from his network of contacts throughout the organization. According to Harriet, Richard called in this morning requesting 2 personal days, effective immediately. First time in 5 years he's taken unplanned time off. The timing was telling, immediately following both the court defeat and the public distancing by Vanessa. How's the organization responding to his absence? Surprisingly well, William observed. Teams are proceeding with their priorities under the governance committee structure. If anything, decision-making seems more efficient without Richard's involvement. This operational resilience represented another significant blow to Richard's self-image as the indispensable leader. Growth Curve was demonstrating that it could function perfectly well, perhaps even better, without his daily presence. And Vanessa? I asked, curious about how she was navigating the aftermath of the article. Completely focused on transition planning for London, William reported. She's been in sequential meetings with HR, facilities, and the European advance team all day. Sanjay says she's approached the role with impressive professionalism given the circumstances. Friday morning brought the culmination of the week's relationship dissolution. I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual, planning to review quarterly projections before a 9 a.m. call with potential German clients. As I stepped off the elevator on the 31st floor, I nearly collided with Vanessa, who was exiting a meeting room with a stack of folders clutched against her chest. Our unexpected proximity created a moment of genuine human awkwardness beneath our professional veneers. For a brief second, we weren't CEO's estranged wife and CEO's girlfriend, but simply 2 women navigating an impossible situation not entirely of either's making. "Mrs. Carter," she acknowledged, her composure admirable despite the circumstances. "I apologize. I didn't see you." "No harm done," I replied. Then, making a decision that surprised even me, I added, "Do you have a moment to speak privately?" Something flickered across her face, apprehension perhaps or curiosity, before she nodded. Of course. I led the way to my office, closing the door behind us to prevent the inevitable interested observations from passing colleagues. Vanessa took the visitor's chair with the careful poise of someone entering dangerous territory, but determined to maintain dignity. "I wanted to congratulate you on the London position," I began, taking my seat behind the desk. The marketing concept Sanjay shared was genuinely impressive. The committee made the right choice based on merit. Her surprise at this professional acknowledgement was evident, though she recovered quickly. "Thank you. I'm looking forward to the opportunity." "I imagine Richard is less enthusiastic about your relocation," I observed, watching her reaction carefully. Vanessa's professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing a complex mixture of emotions before she regained control. "Richard and I have different perspectives on various matters currently." The deliberate understatement almost made me smile. "Including the Tech Insider article, I presume." She met my gaze directly for the first time. "I didn't provide that statement as written, though it does reflect my professional priorities. The reporter constructed it from comments I made to industry contacts before understanding they were speaking with media. It was an explanation, but not quite an apology. Appropriate. Under the circumstances. Media manipulation is an unfortunate reality in situations like ours, I acknowledged. A brief silence fell between us, heavy with the unspoken complexity of our connection. Finally, Vanessa spoke with unexpected candor. When our relationship began, he presented himself as someone in an essentially ceremonial marriage that had run its course, she said, choosing her words with evident care. The reality I've discovered over the past 2 weeks is considerably different. I appreciated her deliberate avoidance of either direct apology or victim positioning. Richard has always excelled at crafting narratives that support his desired outcomes, I observed neutrally. She nodded slightly. I've come to that understanding rather late in the process. Another silence, less tense than the first. We were two intelligent women acknowledging a shared insight about the man who connected us, without descending into the emotional drama he might have expected. London is an excellent opportunity to reset professional narratives, I said finally. Growth Curve's European success will benefit from your marketing expertise, regardless of personal complications at headquarters. That's my focus moving forward, she confirmed, rising to signal the conclusion of our unexpected conversation. At the door, she paused. Mrs. Carter. Elaine, I corrected automatically. Elaine, she amended. For what it's worth, I wouldn't have if I had understood the actual circumstances. I raised a hand to halt her uncomfortable attempt at retroactive boundary setting. The past is immutable, Vanessa. Professional futures are not. I suggest we both focus on the latter. She nodded, visibly relieved at being spared the awkwardness of an unnecessary confession or apology. Thank you for your directness. It's clarifying. As she left, I reflected on the unexpected humanity of our interaction. Vanessa was neither the villain my wounded pride might have cast her as, nor an innocent victim of Richard's manipulation. She was simply a young professional who had made a calculated error in judgment about both a personal relationship and its professional implications, and was now executing an equally calculated exit strategy to salvage what remained of her career: opportunities. By Friday afternoon, the complete dissolution of Richard and Vanessa's relationship was evident to everyone at Growth Curve headquarters. They were observed in a final tense conversation in the parking garage, him gesturing emphatically, her maintaining a composed but unmovable posture before walking away to her car. Witnesses reported no dramatic shouting or scene-making, just the palpable disintegration of whatever connection had once existed between them. When William stopped by my office at the end of the day, his expression suggested he was still processing the week's rapid developments. So, he said, settling into his usual chair, Richard has now lost his court challenge, his potential investor, his girlfriend, and possibly his mind, judging by his behavior this week. An accurate summary, I acknowledged. Are you enjoying this? He asked, studying my face with brotherly directness. Watching him lose everything he values in such rapid succession? I considered the question honestly before responding. I'm not taking pleasure in his pain, if that's what you're asking, but I do find a certain balance in the consequences he's experiencing. William nodded slowly. The board meeting is Tuesday. The governance committee is prepared to recommend leadership structure changes, including potentially removing Richard as CEO if that's what you want. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than I'd anticipated. 5 years ago, I had created Phoenix Ventures to support Richard's dream while protecting our financial future. Now, I held the power to, and not just his dream, but his entire professional identity with a single board vote. What do I want? I echoed, gazing out the window at the Connecticut skyline bathed in late afternoon light. I want Growth Curve to succeed. I want the investment I've nurtured for 5 years to continue growing. I want the employees who make that success possible to thrive under leadership that values their contributions. And Richard? William pressed. I turned back to meet his gaze. Richard needs to understand that actions have consequences, not from vindictiveness, but as a fundamental reality of both business and life. The recommendation to the board should reflect that principle. William studied me for a moment longer before nodding. I'll finalize the committee's proposal this weekend. We can review it Monday before the Tuesday meeting. As he left, I remained at my desk, contemplating the dissolution of the relationship that had triggered this entire chain of events. Richard had left me for Vanessa, believing he could simply discard 20 years of marriage while keeping the professional success that our partnership had built. Now Vanessa had left him, prioritizing her career over a relationship that had proven far more complicated and costly than advertised. The symmetry was both perfect and painful, not because I wished Richard to suffer, but because the pattern so clearly reflected the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of his choices. He had consistently undervalued the people and relationships that contributed to his success, believing himself solely responsible for achievements that were, in reality, collaborative creations. Now, as those relationships systematically dissolved, he was experiencing the natural consequence of that miscalculation: isolation. Not because I had engineered it as revenge, but because reality inevitably corrects flawed assumptions. Sometimes gradually, sometimes with the sudden clarity of a house of cards collapsing under its own contradictions. As I gathered my things to leave for the weekend, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard, the first direct communication he had initiated since the anniversary dinner where he had announced he was leaving me. "We need to talk before Tuesday's board meeting. My house, Sunday 2 p.m. This has gone far enough." I considered the message, noting both the presumptuous tone and the revealing phrase, "my house," the home we had shared for 15 years now claimed as solely his territory. Even in attempted reconciliation, Richard remained fundamentally Richard. After careful consideration, I replied simply, "I'll be there." The stage was set for our first private conversation since the revelation that had changed everything. Whatever Richard planned to propose, whatever new narrative he had constructed to explain the rapid dissolution of his carefully planned new life, I would approach our meeting with the same clear-eyed realism that had guided me through the past 2 weeks. The relationship between Richard and Vanessa had crumbled under pressure, revealing its fundamental instability. Now we would see what remained of the relationship between Richard and me, not as husband and wife, but as business counterparts facing the consequences of choices neither could undo. Sunday afternoon arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn, the maples along Richard's driveway, beginning their transformation into brilliant reds and golds. I pulled my car behind Richard's BMW in the circular drive, noting that Vanessa's silver Audi was nowhere to be seen. This would be a conversation without witnesses. The house looked exactly as it had when I left 2 weeks earlier. The colonial facade impeccably maintained, seasonal planters flanking the front door with carefully arranged chrysanthemums and ornamental kale. Richard had always been particular about curb appeal, insisting that a home's exterior conveyed important messages about its occupants. I wondered briefly what message he thought the house was sending now, occupied by just one person who had never handled the aesthetic details he so valued. I rang the doorbell rather than using my key, a deliberate choice that acknowledged our altered relationship. Through the beveled glass panels, I could see Richard's approaching silhouette, his movements lacking their usual confident stride. When he opened the door, I was struck by the visible changes 2 weeks had wrought. Richard had always been meticulous about his appearance, believing physical presentation was crucial to executive presence. The man who stood before me now looked distinctly diminished, his normally perfect hair slightly unkempt, his weekend casual clothing wrinkled in a way he would never have previously tolerated, his eyes shadowed by either poor sleep or excessive alcohol, possibly both. "Elaine," he acknowledged, stepping back to allow me entry. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, but offered no reciprocal pleasantry as I moved past him into the foyer. The house smelled different, the subtle floral fragrance I had always maintained, replaced by something more masculine and overwhelmingly artificial, as if Richard had discovered air freshener but not the concept of moderation. He led the way to the kitchen, where I noted a half-empty bottle of Macallan 18, Richard's celebratory scotch, reserved for significant business victories, sitting on the counter beside a tumbler with amber remnants. Liquid courage for our conversation, apparently. "Would you like something to drink?" he offered, gesturing vaguely toward the refrigerator. Well, I'm not sure what's in there, actually." "I'm fine," I replied, choosing to stand rather than take a seat at the kitchen island. "You wanted to talk before the board meeting. I'm here." Richard studied me for a moment, his expression a mixture of familiar calculation and unfamiliar uncertainty. The balance of power between us had shifted so fundamentally that our usual conversational patterns no longer applied. He had always been the confident one, secure in his position and control. Now he faced me across a chasm of his own making, searching for leverage that no longer existed. "This has gone far enough, Elaine," he began, his tone striving for authoritative, but achieving only strained. "The past 2 weeks have been disruptive to Growth Curve's operations and damaging to its market position. For the sake of the company, we need to find a reasonable resolution." "Interesting framing," I observed, noting his attempt to position the conflict as mutually detrimental rather than personally devastating to him. "The quarterly numbers suggest operations are proceeding efficiently under the governance protocols. Client relationships are stable, with Berkshire actually expanding their implementation. The European launch preparations are on schedule. By objective metrics, Growth Curve is functioning exceptionally well." He flinched slightly at this evidence-based contradiction of his premise. Market perception matters as much as operational metrics. The public speculation about leadership instability creates uncertainty that will eventually impact valuation. "A valid concern," I acknowledged, "which is precisely why the board's governance committee is prepared to recommend leadership structure changes at Tuesday's meeting to resolve any uncertainty about where authority ultimately resides." Richard's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the counter. "You're really going to do it, aren't you? Push me out of my own company." "You still don't understand," I said, maintaining my composure despite his rising agitation. "It was never just your company, Richard. It was built on my investment, protected by my oversight, and grown through collective effort that you consistently claimed as personal achievement." "I never denied your financial contribution," he countered, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Phoenix Ventures has always been acknowledged as a key investor." "But not as the controlling interest that saved Growth Curve from bankruptcy," I pointed out. "Not as the authority that shaped strategic decisions you presented as your own brilliance. You maintained the fiction of the visionary founder-CEO while systematically obscuring the reality of how decisions were actually made." He paced to the window and back, the restless movement of someone searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "Fine. I should have been more transparent about Phoenix's influence. I should have acknowledged the investment structure more openly. But does that justify this? This systematic dismantling of everything I've built?" The familiar narrative, "everything I've built," revealed how little he had actually internalized from the past 2 weeks. I decided to take a different approach. "Richard," I said quietly, "do you remember what you said at our anniversary dinner? Your exact words?" He looked momentarily confused by this change of direction. I told you I wanted a different life, that I had feelings for Vanessa." "You said, 'I want a different life, Elaine. I'm sorry, but our marriage isn't working for me anymore.'" "It hasn't been for some time," I quoted precisely. "You made a unilateral decision about our 20-year relationship based solely on what was working for you." Understanding began to dawn in his expression as I continued. "Now, I'm making a similar assessment about our business relationship. It isn't working for me anymore, Richard. Your judgment, your leadership approach, your inability to acknowledge others' contributions, None of it serves Growth Curve's best interests moving forward. That's different, he protested, though his tone lacked conviction. Business decisions shouldn't be based on personal grievances. They're not, I assured him. They're based on clear evidence of your decision-making patterns. You've demonstrated repeatedly that you prioritize personal ego over company interest, from taking credit for others' innovations, to pursuing unauthorized buyout attempts to filing meritless emergency motions that created unnecessary legal expenses. I moved closer, ensuring he couldn't avoid meeting my gaze. The recommendation to remove you as CEO isn't personal revenge, Richard. It's sound business judgment based on your demonstrated behavior. Something broke in his expression then, the last remnants of the confident facade he had maintained through escalating professional crises. In its place emerged something I had rarely seen during our 20 years together: genuine vulnerability. "What do you want, Elaine?" he asked, his voice stripped of its usual authoritative resonance. What would it take to end this before Tuesday's meeting? It was the question I had been waiting for, the moment when Richard finally recognized that negotiation, not dictation, was his only remaining option. I took my time before responding, ensuring my terms were specific and enforceable. 3 things, I said finally. First, you transition from CEO to strategic advisor, focusing exclusively on client relationships where you genuinely add value. Second, you acknowledge publicly that Growth Curve's success has been a collaborative achievement with significant contribution from Phoenix Ventures and the executive team. And third, you accept a fair but not excessive severance package structured to incentivize smooth transition rather than further conflict. He stared at me, clearly processing the difference between my terms and the complete removal he had feared. And if I agree? Then I'll recommend the board approve this modified leadership structure rather than termination, I replied. Growth Curve retains the aspects of your contribution that actually create value, while placing operational authority with those better suited to collaborative leadership. Richard moved to the kitchen island, pouring another measure of scotch with a hand. That trembled slightly. The silence stretched between us as he weighed his rapidly diminishing options. His legal challenge had failed. His potential investors had withdrawn. His relationship with Vanessa had collapsed. His only remaining card was the possibility of a protracted, destructive battle that would damage everyone involved, including himself. Who would become CEO? He asked finally, a question that revealed his dawning acceptance of the inevitable. The governance committee recommends Elena Rodriguez as interim CEO while a formal search is conducted, I replied. Her client relationship, skills, and operational discipline make her well suited to guide the transition. His eyebrows rose slightly. He had clearly expected me to nominate William or take the position myself. Not you? I'll remain Phoenix Ventures' representative on the board, maintaining majority shareholder oversight without direct operational involvement, I explained. My expertise is financial strategy, not day-to-day executive leadership. This self-awareness about my own strengths and limitations seemed to surprise him. Throughout our marriage, Richard had consistently underestimated my business acumen while overestimating his own. The fact that I recognized boundaries he had never acknowledged challenged his fundamental narrative about both of us. He took a long swallow of scotch before responding. And the divorce? Proceeds as a separate matter through appropriate legal channels, I replied. The prenuptial agreement provides a clear framework. I don't intend to contest its terms regarding personal assets. Just like that? He pressed, searching for the vindictiveness he had expected. 20 years of marriage concluded with a legal formality? I met his gaze steadily. You ended our marriage at an anniversary dinner, Richard. I'm simply handling the administrative details with the same efficiency you brought to the emotional dissolution. The parallel landed as intended, reflected in the tightening of his expression. He moved to the window overlooking the garden I had designed and maintained. Throughout our marriage, the carefully planned perennial beds now slightly overgrown after just 2 weeks without my attention. I never meant to hurt you, he said finally, his back still turned. I just wanted a different life, I completed his sentence, echoing his words from that devastating dinner. And you've achieved exactly that. Though perhaps not quite as you envisioned. He turned back to face me, something like genuine regret flickering across his features. I underestimated you. I always did, didn't I? Yes, I acknowledged simply. A miscalculation that ultimately cost you far more than it ever cost me. Another silence fell between us, heavy with 20 years of shared history now viewed through irrevocably altered perspectives. The man I had married, the partner I had supported financially and emotionally through multiple career iterations, the husband I had believed in even when his ambitions outstripped his capabilities. That man was still visible in Richard's features, but fundamentally transformed by the consequences of his own choices. "I'll accept your terms," he said finally, the word seeming physically difficult to pronounce. "Strategic advisor role, public acknowledgement of collaborative achievement, negotiated severance package." He paused, then added with a ghost of his former confidence, "But I want input on the CEO search committee. My industry connections still have value." It was such a characteristically Richard response, acceptance immediately followed by an attempt to maintain some control, that I almost smiled. The committee structure can be negotiated as part of the transition framework. William will work with your attorney to formalize the agreement before Tuesday's meeting. He nodded, relief and resignation mingling in his expression. "Vanessa's really gone, you know," he offered unexpectedly. "Completely committed to the London position. Won't even discuss continuing our relationship remotely." I had no interest in processing Richard's romantic disappointments, but I recognized the statement for what it was, an oblique acknowledgement that his grand passion, the relationship worth destroying our marriage for, had proven as insubstantial as I had predicted. People often recalculate their positions when circumstances change, I observed neutrally. Professional opportunities sometimes outweigh personal entanglements. He flinched slightly at the implied parallel to his own choice to prioritize desire over commitment. She said I wasn't the person she thought I was. "Few of us are," I replied, gathering my purse from the counter and signaling the conclusion of our conversation. "William will contact your attorney tomorrow to begin drafting the transition framework. I suggest you use the intervening time to prepare for a graceful public acknowledgement of the leadership changes." At the front door, Richard made one final attempt to reclaim some emotional equilibrium. "For what it's worth, Elaine, I am sorry. Not just for how things ended, but for never truly seeing you. For 20 years, I looked right past who you really were." I paused, one hand on the doorknob, and considered his belated recognition. "That's the irony, Richard. I always saw you exactly as you were, with all your strengths and limitations. I chose to build a life with that real person, flaws and all. You chose to leave that life based on a fantasy about both Vanessa and yourself that couldn't survive first contact with reality." He had no response to this fundamental truth, and I required none. As I walked to my car, the autumn sunlight, casting long shadows across the driveway we had once shared, I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, just the quiet certainty that balance had been restored. Richard had chosen to leave me for what he believed would be a better life with his young assistant. Instead, he had triggered a cascade of consequences that stripped away his professional identity, his new relationship, and the carefully constructed narrative of self-made success he had maintained for decades. I had lost a husband, but reclaimed my authentic self in the process. The financial strategist whose investment had built a thriving company. The woman whose judgment had quietly shaped business decisions attributed to others. The person whose value extended far beyond the supporting role I had accepted in our marriage. As I drove away from the home where we had spent 15 years together, I felt a sense of completion rather than vindication. Richard's betrayal had been painful, but it had also catalyzed a necessary reckoning, not just for him, but for me as well. The masks we had both worn throughout our marriage had been stripped away, revealing truths that could no longer be ignored or obscured. He would continue as strategic advisor, a diminished but still valuable contributor to the company that had once been his primary identity. I would continue as majority shareholder, guiding Growth Curve's strategic direction while pursuing new opportunities that leveraged my financial expertise. Our paths would intersect professionally, but never again personally, a clean separation that honored the reality of who we had become rather than the fiction of who we had pretended to be. 6 months later, as I sat in my new apartment overlooking the harbor, reviewing Growth Curve's record-breaking quarterly results under Elena's leadership, I received a brief email from Richard. Attached was a press release announcing his engagement to Margaret Wells, Gordon's recently divorced daughter, a socially appropriate match with impeccable Greenwich credentials. I sent a simple congratulatory response, genuinely hoping he had found authentic connection rather than another ego-boosting fantasy. Richard's capacity for self-deception had always been his greatest vulnerability, and I had no desire to see him repeat patterns that had proven so destructive to everyone involved. My own life had evolved in unexpected directions. Phoenix Ventures had expanded beyond Growth Curve to invest in promising women-led startups, leveraging both my capital and my hard-won wisdom about authentic leadership. My relationship with William had deepened from siblings to true business partners. Our complementary skills creating opportunities neither could have developed alone. And most surprisingly, I had begun a cautious friendship with Jonathan Barnes, the CFO of Berkshire Financial, whose appreciation for both financial strategy and classic literature had evolved from professional conversations to occasional dinner, discussions about subjects far beyond business metrics. The painful revelation at my anniversary dinner, watching my husband of 20 years announce he was leaving me for his assistant, had indeed changed everything, though not in the ways either Richard or I had anticipated. What he had intended as an ending had instead been a beginning, the catalyst for both of us to finally become who we truly were, rather than who we had pretended to be for 2 decades. As I closed my laptop and moved to the balcony of my new home, watching sailboats navigate the harbor with the changing winds, I reflected on the perfect symmetry of consequences that had unfolded. Richard had discarded a marriage in pursuit of a fantasy that couldn't survive reality. In the process, he had lost the professional identity he valued even more than personal relationships. I had lost a husband but gained something far more valuable: the freedom to fully inhabit my authentic self without diminishing my abilities to maintain someone else's illusions. The company Richard believed he had built now thrived under leadership that acknowledged its collaborative foundations. The investment I had made to support his dreams now generated returns that funded my own. It wasn't revenge that had brought us to this point. It was simply reality asserting itself after years of carefully maintained fiction. Richard had believed he could discard me while keeping everything my support had helped him build. The past 6 months had systematically demonstrated the fundamental error in that calculation. As the autumn sun set over the harbor, painting the water in shades of gold and amber, I raised my glass in a silent toast to unexpected outcomes and perfect symmetry. Richard had left me for his assistant, not knowing I was his anonymous investor. That singular miscalculation had changed everything for both of us, but especially for me. The wife he had underestimated had become the businesswoman he couldn't outmaneuver. The silent partner he had overlooked had become the majority owner he couldn't challenge. The woman he had discarded had become someone even he finally recognized as formidable. It wasn't the ending Richard had imagined when he practiced his departure speech for our anniversary dinner. It wasn't the future I had anticipated when I created Phoenix Ventures to support his dreams while protecting our financial security. It was better, more honest, more balanced, more true to who we both really were beneath the roles we had played for 20 years. And in that authentic truth, painful as its revelation had been, lay the most perfect revenge of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.